Welcome in the journey of time. Tonight we'll sail through another page of history. Maybe you're already lying in bed, relaxing, or perhaps you've simply decided to let the past accompany you for a while. Where are you joining me from tonight? Leave a comment if you'd like. I always enjoy hearing about your corner of the world. If you find this slow and thoughtful stories brings you a peaceful and comfort, I'd be honored if you subscribed. So here's the story. The fire was the heart of the Chai's, the winter house. Its light did not so much push back the profound darkness of a Hokkaido night as it did command a small, warm kingdom of its own, a dominion of flickering amber and dancing shadows. The air was thick with the scent of burning birch and the rich, oily smell of salmon smoking in the rafters. An old woman, her face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles carved by wind and wisdom, stirred a pot of stew over the flames. Her name was Matt, and she was the grandmother, the storyteller, the keeper of memory. Her grandchildren, two boys and a girl with wide, dark eyes that reflected the firelight, huddled close on thick bear pelts. The wind outside, the Yuan Kamui or storm god, howled its lament, but inside they were safe. The little girl, Ainu, whispered, her voice small against the storm's roar. "Tell us a story. Tell us where we come from." Matt smiled, a slow, gentle cracking of her weathered face. She did not begin with once upon a time, for to the Ainu, time was not a line but a circle, a great wheel of seasons and spirits. She began, as her grandmother had before her, with a song, a low, guttural chant that was not quite music and not quite speech, but something far older, the very voice of the land itself. "I will not tell you a story of kings and castles of stone," she chanted, her voice rasping like river stones tumbling together. "I will tell you a story written in the tracks of the bear, sung by the river, and whispered by the bones of the mountain. This is the story of our people. This is how we learned to live." And as the fire crackled and the wind sang its chorus, the story began to unfold, not from her lips alone, but from the very soul of the land. The world was new, still wet with creation. A dense, primordial mist, the Nupuripa, clung to the shoulders of the mountains, and the forests were a deep, impenetrable green, untouched by axe or fire. This was a time before memory, when the land itself was a living, breathing entity. In this world, the first Ainu awoke. He was not a god, nor was he fashioned from clay or divine breath. He was simply there, a part of the landscape that had become conscious. He felt the cold kiss of the morning dew on his skin, the soft, yielding moss beneath his bare feet. He was cold, and he was alone. He did not know his name, for names had not yet been invented. He only knew sensation, the gnawing emptiness in his belly, the chill that seeped into his bones, and a profound, overwhelming awe for the world around him. He looked up and saw the sun, Chup Kamui, and felt its warmth on his face. He did not see a ball of fire millions of miles away. He saw a benevolent spirit, a god who gave him light and warmth. He saw the trees, Kina Canop, not as lumber, but as towering beings who offered shelter and fruit. The river that rushed past, Pet Kamui, was a powerful, thrumming deity, its voice a constant roar that promised life and sustenance. Every rock, every blade of grass, every insect was imbued with a spirit, a Kamui. He was not the master of this world. He was a humble guest in a kingdom of gods. His first task was survival. His stomach clenched with a hunger he did not understand. He saw birds eating red berries from a bush. Cautiously, he plucked one. It was tart and juicy. He ate more, and the hunger receded. He saw a fish, silver and sleek, flash in the clear water of the river. He reached in, but his hands were clumsy, and the fish darted away. He tried for hours, his fingers growing numb, his frustration mounting. Finally, in a moment of desperate inspiration, he sharpened a stick with a sharp stone and thrust it into the water. He missed again and again. But then, a lucky strike. The stick pierced the fish's side. He pulled it out, a wriggling, dying piece of silver. He ate it raw, the flesh cold and slippery, and it was the most magnificent thing he had ever tasted. He learned to build a shelter, not a house, but a simple lean-to of branches and broad leaves to keep the rain off. He learned to listen to the forest. The warning chatter of a squirrel meant a fox was near. The sudden silence of the birds could mean a large predator was on the move. He was learning the language of the Kamui. He was not conquering nature. He was learning its grammar, its etiquette. He was discovering the first, most fundamental rule of Ainu existence: to take only what you need, to give thanks for what you take, and understand that you are but one small thread in a vast, living tapestry. One evening, as he huddled by a small fire he had painstakingly coaxed alive, he saw another figure across the river. Another like him, a woman. She stood, watching him with the same wide, fearful, curious eyes. They did not speak. Language did not exist yet. But they recognized something in each other, a shared loneliness, a shared struggle. Slowly, hesitantly, he held up a fish he had caught, an offering, a connection. This was the true first breath of the Ainu. Not a single moment of creation, but a slow, painful, beautiful awakening into a world alive with spirit, and the dawning realization that survival meant not just understanding the land, but becoming a part of its sacred conversation. Seasons turned. The solitary man, who had come to think of himself as Okikirmi, the one who listens, and the woman, whom he called Shiromi, the quiet one, build a life together. Their first, crude lean-to evolved into a pit house, dug partially into the earth for warmth, with a frame of young trees and a roof of sod and bark. It was a humble chise, but it was a home. The central hearth, the apahusi, became the literal and spiritual center of their world. Their communication began with gestures and shared tasks, but soon blossomed into a true language, born from the world around them. The word for river, pet, was the sound of water gurgling over stones. The word for wind, rera, was the sighing of the pines. Their vocabulary was a lexicon of the land, each syllable rooted in the earth, the water, the sky. They did not have a word for war, for the concept was alien. They had many words for snow: Yupis for new snow, Apkas for settled snow, Conru for hard, crusty snow, because understanding snow was a matter of life and death. Their family grew. First one child, a boy with a loud, demanding cry, then a girl with eyes as dark and deep as a forest pool. With children came the need for more than mere survival. It brought the need for culture, for meaning, for ritual. Okikirmi was a skilled hunter. He had learned to read the forest like a scroll. He could follow the faintest scratch on bark that marked a bear's passage, could interpret the meaning behind a broken twig, could smell the musky scent of a deer on the wind. One autumn, he tracked a great Hokkaido brown bear, Kimun Kamui, the god who rules the mountains. It was a massive creature, its fur a shaggy cloak of dark brown, its power evident in every ripple of its shoulder muscles. To hunt such a being was not an act of violence. It was a sacred undertaking. The hunt lasted for days. Okikirmi followed the bear not with aggression, but with a respectful distance, observing its habits, its dignity. He crafted a special spear. its tip painstakingly chipped from obsidian, its shaft adorned with carved patterns. Moru, the swirling designs that were the fingerprints of the spirits. When the moment came, it was swift and solemn. The bear, drinking from a stream, turned and saw him. There was a moment of profound understanding between man and beast, a silent communication that acknowledged the necessity of the act. Okikirmi threw a spear true. The bear's death was not a victory, but a solemn transaction. Okikirmi approached the great body with reverence. He knelt beside it and spoke to its spirit, his voice thick with emotion. "O divine ruler of the mountains," he whispered, his breath misting in the cold air. "Thank you for this gift. Thank you for offering your flesh to feed my children, your fur to warm them through the winter. Your mighty spirit we will honor. We will send you back to your divine parents adorned with our finest treasures, so you may tell them of the respect we hold for you." He butchered the carcass with ritual care, saving every usable part. The meat would be food. The hide would become blankets and clothing. The bones and skull, however, were something else entirely. They were the vessel of the god. Back at the Chai's, the entire family prepared for the Ayamant, the sending back ceremony. The bear's head was placed on a special platform near the hearth, adorned with enau, carved wooden prayer sticks, whittled with curled shavings that were meant to act as messengers to the spirit world. They offered the bear's own meat, the best cuts, placed before it on beautifully carved trays. They offered dried fish, millet dumplings, and bowls of sake they had fermented from wild grains. For 3 days and 3 nights, they sang and chanted. They told the bear's spirit stories of their family. They played a stringed instrument, the tongkori, its melancholic notes weaving through the smoke-filled air. They danced, their movements mimicking the bear's powerful gait, a final, respectful tribute. They were not celebrating a kill. They were hosting an honored guest, a god in mortal form, and sending it back to the spiritual realm with great fanfare, hoping it would choose to return again one day, bringing its blessings with it. As the flames of the ritual fire danced, reflecting in the glassy eyes of the bear's skull, little Aina, the granddaughter, watched, mesmerized. She saw the tears on her grandfather's cheeks, the solemn joy on her grandmother's face. She didn't understand the complex theology, but she felt the profound emotion, the gratitude, the reverence, the beautiful, heartbreaking cycle of life and death. It was her first true lesson in what it meant to be Ainu. It was not about owning the land, but about belonging to it and honoring the sacred contract that bound all living things. Generations flowed like the river Pet Kamui. The solitary family of Okikirmi and Shiromi became a cluster of families, a community bound by blood, shared struggle, and a common understanding of the world. They chose a site for their village, a koten, with the careful consideration of one selecting a sacred altar. It was on a high riverbank, safe from spring floods, backed by a dense forest that provided wood and game, and facing the morning sun, the blessing of Chup Kamui. The koten was not a haphazard collection of dwellings. It was an organic extension of the landscape. The Chai's houses, perhaps a dozen of them now, were arranged in a loose semicircle facing the water, their bowed, sod-covered roofs making them look like a litter of bear cubs nestled against the earth. Smoke curled lazily from their central hearths, the threads of human life woven into the sky. Paths, worn smooth by bare feet, connected the houses to the river, the forest, and the communal clearing at the village's center. This clearing was the koten's beating heart. Here, the children played, their laughter a bright counterpoint to the forest's murmur. Here, the women gathered to weave a tush, the elm bark cloth, their fingers flying as they twisted the tough fibers into soft, durable fabric, their voices a low, companionable hum as they shared stories and wisdom. Here, the men returned from hunting or fishing, their arrival sparking activity and appraisal. The social order of the Khotan was subtle, based on respect earned, not power demanded. The eldest and most experienced hunter, a man named Sam, was their de facto chief. His authority did not come from decree, but from the weight of his wisdom. He settled disputes not with punishment, but with stories that revealed a deeper truth. He decided when the community would move to their coastal settlement for the summer salmon run. His judgment trusted because it was always rooted in a profound reading of the signs. The run of the fish, the behavior of the birds, the whispers of the wind. Alongside him was the Nishipa, the spiritual leader, an old woman named Ureshi. While Sam interpreted the physical world, Ureshi interpreted the spiritual one. She was the bridge between the people and the Kamui. When a child fell ill, it was Ureshi who was summoned. She would enter the chais, the air thick with the scent of drying herbs and fear. She would chant, her voice a low, guttural river of sound, and scatter offerings of inao and tobacco, pleading with the offending spirit to depart. Her face, tattooed around her lips and hands with the dark blue patterns that marked her as a married woman and a conduit to the spirit world, was a mask of intense concentration. The villagers waited outside, their anxiety a palpable force, until Ureshi emerged, her expression softening, and announced the fever would break. The collective sigh of relief was a prayer in itself. The division of labor was clear, a symbiotic dance of survival. The men were the providers of protein and raw materials. Aina, now a young woman, watched her father and brothers leave at dawn, their silhouettes swallowed by the green maw of the forest. They would return with deer, with rabbit, with the divine bear, their bodies weary, but their spirits alight with the quiet pride of a successful negotiation with the Kamui. The women were the sustainers. They processed everything the men brought back. Aino worked alongside her mother, sisters, and aunts. They butchered the meat with knives of obsidian, their hands moving with practiced efficiency. They scraped the hides clean, then softened them by chewing the leather, a tedious, jaw-aching task that made the tough skins pliable for clothing and blankets. They gathered the bounty of the forest, berries, nuts, roots, and over 100 varieties of edible plants and medicinal herbs, their knowledge a vast, unwritten encyclopedia of botany. One evening, as the sun bled into the western mountains, Aina sat with the women around a large, flat rock, grinding nuts into a paste. Her hands were stained, her back ached, but she felt a deep sense of belonging. She looked at the Khotan, the sturdy chais, the playing children, the smoke rising to meet the first stars, and she understood. This was not just a village. It was a single, living organism, each person a vital cell, each task a necessary function, all bound together by the sacred breath of the Kamui and the unbreakable will of its people. They had learned that alone. They were vulnerable, but together they were a force as enduring as the mountains themselves. As Aina grew into womanhood, her body changed, and with it, her place in the intricate social tapestry of the Khotan. Her first blood was met not with shame, but with a solemn seclusion. For several days, she stayed in a small, separate corner of the chais, her food passed to her by her mother. It was a time of quiet reflection, Ureshi explained, for her body was now powerful with the ability to create life, and that power needed to be contained and respected, lest it disrupt the spiritual balance of the community. It was after this seclusion that the process of her tattooing began. It was her aunt, a woman with gentle hands and a reputation for creating the most beautiful sekuni mouth tattoos, who performed the ritual. The first session was for her hands. Ina sat perfectly still, her heart thrumming like a captured bird. Her aunt took a small, sharp knife, its blade honed to a fine edge. She dipped the tip in a paste of powdered charcoal mixed with bare fat and water. Then, with a series of quick, precise pricks, she began to trace the patterns around Ina's knuckles and the backs of her hands. The pain was sharp and insistent, a burning needlepoint that made Ina flinch. Her mother, sitting beside her, placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Breathe, little one," her mother whispered. "Each drop of blood is an offering. Each line is a prayer. These marks will give you strength. They will allow your prayers to be heard more clearly by the Kamui. They will make you truly Ainu." Tears welled in Ina's eyes, but she did not cry out. She focused on the meaning behind the pain. The geometric lines and spirals were not mere decoration. They were a permanent inscription of her identity and her spiritual connectivity. They were armor for her soul. As the black ink settled under her skin, she felt a transformation beginning. She was being remade, marked as a keeper of tradition, a future wife, a future mother. The most significant tattoos were those around her lips. This was a process that would continue bit by bit over years until she was married. The first cut was made just above her upper lip, a thin line that stretched from one corner of her mouth to the other. The pain was intense, so close to her sensitive flesh, and the swelling afterwards made it difficult to eat for days. But when she looked at her reflection in a still pool of water, she saw not a disfigured face, but the face of her grandmother, her mother, her aunts, a lineage of strong Ainu women staring back at her. The blue-black lines were a badge of honor, a visible sign of her endurance and her commitment to the ways of her people. The men, too, had their rituals of passage. Ina's younger brother, Rera, named for the wind, was coming of age. His test was not one of enduring pain, but of skill and courage. He was to go on his first solo hunt. For 3 days, he prepared, fasting and praying, crafting his own spear under the watchful eye of his father and Sam, the village chief. The morning he left, the entire Khotan gathered to see him off. There were no boisterous cheers, only quiet, respectful nods. The forest would be his judge. Ina waited anxiously. She helped with the chores, but her mind was in the deep woods with her brother. On the evening of the second day, just as the worry in the chais was becoming a thick, unspoken dread, a whistle echoed from the forest edge. It was the signal of a successful hunter. Rera emerged from the trees. He was dirty, exhausted, but his eyes shone with a new, hard-won light. Slung over his shoulder was a young sika deer. He did not boast. He walked to the center of the clearing and laid the deer down with reverence. Sam approached, placed a hand on his shoulder, and nodded. That single gesture was worth more than any speech. Rera was no longer a boy. He was a provider, a man. The community would feast on his kill, and in doing so, they would absorb his success as their own, strengthening the bonds that held the Khotan together. The marks on Ina's skin and the quiet pride in Rera's eyes were two different expressions of the same truth. To be Ainu was to be forever linked to the community and the spirits, in life, in ritual, and in the very marks upon one's body. Life in the Khotan was not a monotonous struggle. It was a sacred dance to the rhythm of the seasons, a cyclical journey between two worlds. When the last of the winter snows melted, revealing the wet, dark earth and the first tender shoots of the kitapiro, a wild onion, pushed through the soil, a palpable energy, surged through the village. It was time to migrate. The winter Khotan, nestled in its sheltered river valley, was abandoned for the summer settlement on the coast. The preparation was a communal frenzy. Chais were sealed, belongings were packed into woven baskets and strapped to backs. The most precious items, ceremonial Ainu, ancestral swords received in trade, bear skulls from past Diamant, were carefully wrapped and carried by the elders. The entire village became a moving entity, a slow, purposeful snake of people winding its way down from the mountains towards the roaring, vast ocean. The coastal world was a different kingdom, ruled by a different set of Kamui. The air was sharp with the tang of salt and decaying seaweed. The thunder of the waves was the voice of Ripon Kamui, the god of the sea and the bounty it held. Their summer dwellings were lighter, more temporary structures, designed to catch the ocean breezes. Here, the rhythm of life changed. The men took to the sea in their CIPS, the dugout canoes they hollowed from great logs. Ainu watched them launch, her father and brothers pushing the sleek vessels through the surf with a powerful grace. The CIPS were incredibly seaworthy, cutting through the waves as the men used paddles and harpoons to hunt the ocean's gods, the giant octopus, the seal, the whale. A successful whale hunt was an event of monumental importance, requiring days of ritual and communal effort to butcher, its meat and blubber sustaining the village for months. But the true summer bounty, the one that involved every single member of the Khotan, was the salmon run. When a silver torrent of fish fought their way up the rivers to spawn, it was a time of intense, back-breaking labor and immense celebration. The entire community worked from dawn until dusk. The men stood in the rushing, icy water, using spears and nets to haul in the thrashing, silvery bodies. The women and children worked on the banks, their knives a blur of motion as they gutted, cleaned, and filleted the fish with breathtaking speed. Long racks were erected along the shore, and thousands of salmon fillets were hung to dry in the sun and wind, transforming the Khotan into a landscape of silver. The air hummed with flies and echoed with the sounds of work songs, the rhythmic thud of knives on wood, and the laughter of children chasing each other between the racks. For Aina, her tattooed hands now strong and skilled, this was the height of the year. The sheer abundance was a direct blessing from Ripon Kamui and Pet Kamui, a tangible promise of survival through the next winter. As the days shortened and the air grew crisp, the dance reversed. The salmon racks were taken down, the summer huts were dismantled, and the people, heavier with preserved food and memories of the sea, trekked back to their mountain Khotan. The winter was a time of turning inward. The Chais, sealed against the blizzards, became self-contained universes. This was the time for storytelling, for the long, epic euchre chanted by the elders, tales of heroic ancestors and trickster hares that taught moral lessons and preserved history. It was a time for crafting, for carving wood, weaving intricate patterns into textiles, and repairing tools. It was a time for family, for the quiet, deep bonds that were the true warmth against the cold. Aina, now a woman with the marks of her people on her face and the skills of her ancestors in her hands, understood the deep wisdom of this migration. It was not a nomadic wandering, but a conscious participation in the full spectrum of their world. They were children of the mountains and the sea, and by moving between them, they honored both, ensuring the balance of their lives and the favor of all the Kamui. The rhythm of the seasons was the heartbeat of the Ainu, a pulse that had thrummed for centuries and, she prayed, would thrum for centuries more. The CIP was more than a boat. It was a sliver of the forest daring to challenge the sea. Carved from a single, massive log of cedar or spruce. Its creation was a ritual in itself. The selected tree was apologized to, offered sake and inao, before being felled with stone axes and painstakingly hollowed out with fire and adzes. The finished vessel was sleek, graceful, and incredibly resilient, capable of riding the swells of the open ocean. It was in these CIPS that the Ainu spirit of exploration found its wings. The world was vast, and the Kamui resided everywhere. The known world of Hokkaido, which they called Ainu Mashir, was not the entirety of their universe. Legends, passed down in Euchre, spoke of islands to the north, shrouded in mist and mystery, where strange mountains breathed fire and the sea boiled. A young man named Parika, Ainu's second cousin, possessed a restlessness that the seasonal rhythms of the Khotan could not entirely satisfy. He was a master of the CIP, feeling the ocean's moods through the soles of his feet and the paddle in his hands. He had heard the stories from a trader from a distant Khotan, stories of the Kuril Islands, a string of jagged lands where the sea otter pelts were thicker, more lustrous than any seen before. One spring, with the blessing of the elders and the supplies for a long journey, Parika and a crew of 4 other bold men launched their CP into the uncertain embrace of Ripon Kamui. Their departure was washed with a mixture of pride and fear. They were sailing into the realm of legend. For days, they saw nothing but the endless, heaving gray of the sea and sky. They navigated by the sun, the stars, and the flight patterns of birds. They drank rainwater collected in sealskin bladders and ate dried salmon and hardened millet cakes. Their bodies grew salt-encrusted, their muscles aching from the constant paddling and bailing. The ocean was a fickle god, one moment calm and benevolent, the next whipping itself into a fury of white-capped waves that threatened to swallow their fragile craft whole. Just as doubt began to gnaw at their resolve, a dark smudge appeared on the horizon. As they drew closer, it resolved into a towering island, its spine a line of sharp volcanic peaks, one of which trailed a faint wisp of smoke into the sky. The air smelled of sulfur. They had found the smoking islands, the land of fire. They landed on a black sand beach, their COP scraping ashore. The landscape was alien, dramatic, and beautiful. The flora was different, the bird calls strange. And there, playing in the kelp beds, were the sea otters. Their pelts were indeed magnificent, a deep, rich brown, incredibly dense. But Parika also saw the intelligence in their eyes, the complex social bonds of the otter families. He felt the familiar reverence. They were not here to plunder. They were here to engage in a new sacred transaction with a new manifestation of Kamui. They built a temporary shelter and hunted with respect, taking only a few otters, offering prayers and inao to their spirits. They explored the island, finding hot springs that steamed in the cold air, and evidence that others had been here before them. The remains of a fire circle, a broken piece of a different style of pottery. They were not the first people here, but they were among the first Ainu to formally incorporate this land into their mental map of Ainu Mashir. Their return journey was laden with treasure, precious otter pelts, strange shells, and volcanic glass for toolmaking. But their greatest treasure was the story. When their CIP was sighted from the shore, the entire Khotan rushed to the beach. Parika stood in the bow, not as a boastful conqueror, but as a humble witness returned from the edge of the world. That night, by the communal fire, he did not just describe what he had seen. He chanted a new Euchre, the epic of the voyage to the smoking mountains, weaving the waves, the fear, the wonder, and the fiery beauty of the new land into a saga that would become part of the people's collective memory. The world had grown larger, and the Ainu had proven that their courage and their curiosity were as vast as the sea itself. The memory of the sickness was a scar upon the soul of the Khotan, a patch of spiritual permafrost where nothing joyful could take root. The air within the settlement, once thrumming with the vibrant energy of a people in constant conversation with their world, now felt thin and brittle. The laughter of children was a rare, startling sound. The great communal tasks of processing the salmon run or preparing a bear for the ayamant were now carried out with a grim, silent efficiency. The sacred songs that once accompanied them stifled by the ever-present weight of loss. Isamu, Ainu's son, carried his own private scar, one that festered with a profound and complicated guilt. He had been the most vocal proponent of embracing the Wajan and their goods. He had held up the iron kettle and the steel axe as icons of a brighter, easier future. Now, he saw them for what they were, the beautiful, poisoned fruit of a foreign tree. The efficiency they offered felt like a betrayal. Every time he used the sharp, cold steel to butcher a deer, he thought of the slow, respectful ritual of sharpening his obsidian blade, a process that felt like a prayer to the spirit of the stone. The obsidian required him to listen, to understand its grain and its will. The steel demanded nothing but force. His restlessness was a physical ache. He could not sit in the silence of the grieving chais. He found himself drawn to the CIPS, the dugout canoes pulled up on the shore. Running his hands over the smooth, weathered hull of his own vessel, he felt a clarity he found nowhere else. The CIP did not judge. It was a testament to a pure relationship, a tree transformed by prayer, fire, and adds into a tool that allowed a man to dance with the sea god, Ripon Kamui. It was an extension of the Ainu will, not a replacement for it. It was this need for purity, for a challenge untainted by the complicated shadows of the South, that drove him to propose the Northern Expedition. He did not frame it as a trading mission to the elders, but as a pilgrimage. The world has grown small and sour here, he told them, his voice low but intense in the council of elders, held in Sam's smoke-filled chais. The spirits here are grieving with us. We need to remind ourselves who we are. We need to find a place where the air is still clean, where the Kamui are not angry or silent. The old stories speak of Yamashir, a great land to the north, where the Neef people live. They are strong. They are not broken. We can go to them not as beggars or students, but as equals. We can learn their ways and remind them of our strength. The old men, their faces etched with the same grief that haunted him, listened. Sam, who had aged a decade in the months since Yureshi's death, finally nodded, his eyes holding Isamu's. The river needs to flow, or it becomes a swamp. Go, Isamu. Go and see if our people can still flow. Bring back a story that is not about death. The preparation was a catharsis for the whole Khotan. For the first time since the plague, they had a shared purpose that was not about mere survival. The women prepared the light, durable travel food, pounded dried salmon mixed with fat and berries into dense, nutritious cakes, and sacks of dried sea urchin roe. The men helped Isamu and his 4 chosen companions, his steady cousin Rena, the sharp-eyed young hunter Mako, and the experienced brothers Ben and Huru, prepare the 3 CIPS for the long voyage. They checked every seam, coated the holes in fresh seal fat, and carved new paddles from seasoned ash. The act of creation, of looking forward, began to slowly, gently, sand down the sharpest edges of their collective sorrow. The day of departure arrived under a sky the color of a fresh bruise, threatening rain. The entire Khotan gathered on the stony beach, the mood a complex tapestry of anxiety, hope, and solemnity. This was not a routine fishing trip. It was a venture into the unknown, a testament to their resilience. Aina, her face a mask of stoic pride, embraced her son. She did not say be safe. Instead, she pressed a small, intricately carved Ainu into his palm, a prayer for clear vision and a strong heart. Listen to the water, she whispered, her voice rough with emotion. And listen to what is behind the water. With a final push, the three CIPS slid into the choppy, gray water. The paddles dipped in unison, the sound a sharp, purposeful counterpoint to the mournful cry of the gulls. Isamu, in the lead boat, did not look back. He fixed his eyes on the horizon, on the indistinct line where the leaden sea met the heavier sky. The first cold drops of rain began to fall, stinging his face. He welcomed them. This was a clean pain, a physical challenge that he understood. It was the pain of effort, of wind and wave, not the silent, creeping pain of a dying culture. With every pull of the paddle, he felt he was not just moving north. He was moving away from the ghost that haunted his home and towards the hope of a story that could, perhaps, begin to heal them. The coastline of Hokkaido, so familiar and comforting, slowly receded, its green, forested mountains softening into a blue-gray haze. Soon, there was nothing but the heaving, endless expanse of the sea. The world reduced itself to the rhythm of the waves, the creak of the sipi, the burn of mussels, and the shared, unspoken determination of the five men. They were a tiny speck of life and will upon the vast, indifferent domain of Ripon Kamui, and in that terrifying simplicity, Isamu began to feel the first, faint stirrings of the peace he had been searching for. The voyage north was a trial of endurance, a days-long conversation with a sea god whose moods were vast and mercurial. The initial rainstorm gave way to a clinging, oppressive fog that swallowed sound and sight, reducing their world to the few feet of gray, swirling water around their CIPS. They navigated by instinct, by the subtle pull of hidden currents, and by the taste of the air, which grew colder and sharper with each passing league. They slept in shifts in the cramped hulls, curled against the stored provisions, their bodies aching, their dreams filled with the phantom shapes of leviathans gliding in the deep. On the third day, the fog burned away under a pale, distant sun, revealing a new world. The coastline of Imashur was not the familiar, forest-clad slopes of home. It was a land of a harsher, more monumental beauty. To the west, the land rose not in rounded, tree-covered mountains, but in great, treeless swells of ancient rock, their peaks lost in a shroud of low cloud. The shoreline was a dramatic meeting of sheer cliffs and black, volcanic sand beaches, against which the sea crashed with a relentless, thunderous roar. The very air was different, carrying the rich, primal scent of wet stone, decaying kelp, and something else, a musky, animal odor they could not place. It was Ben, with his hunter's eyes, who saw them first. There, he whispered, his voice hoarse from the sea air, pointing a trembling finger towards a narrow, pebbled cove. A group of figures stood there, as still as the stones themselves, watching them. The Nifk. Isamu felt a knot of tension tighten in his stomach. This was the moment. He raised a hand, signaling the other CIPS to hold back. He guided his own vessel forward slowly, deliberately, making no sudden moves. As they drew closer, the details of the strangers became clear. They were tall, with broad, flat faces and eyes that held a flinty reserve. They were dressed in hooded parkas of reindeer skin, the fur turned inward, and their legs were wrapped in sealskin boots that reached their knees. They carried long, bone-tipped spears, not held in aggression, but resting easily in their hands, a part of their posture. The two groups regarded each other across 20 paces of water, the only sound the crunch of their CIPS grinding onto the shore. Isamu's men did not reach for their weapons, but their hands rested near them. The silence was a tangible thing, heavy with 1,000 years of separate history. Remembering the dignity of his own people, Isamu was the first to move. He stepped carefully out of the sea of pea, his legs unsteady after days at sea. He laid his own spear down on the stones, then placed a hand over his heart, the traditional Ainu greeting. He then bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect for the spirits of this foreign land. The lead Nifk, a man whose face was a web of lines carved by wind and cold, watched him impassively. His eyes, the color of dark river stones, flicked from Isamu's face to the laid-down spear to the other men in the boats. After a long, assessing moment, he grunted. He did not bow, but he mirrored the gesture, placing a large, calloused hand over his own chest. He then gestured to his men, who relaxed their stance almost imperceptibly. The first, most critical barrier had been crossed. They had acknowledged each other's humanity. Now came the true test, communication. Isamu pointed to himself. "Isamu," he said clearly. He then gestured to his men, naming them one by one. The Nifk leader understood. He thumped his own chest. "Daxa." His voice was a low rumble, like stones grinding together deep underground. He named his companions. The trading began, a painstaking pantomime of need and offer. Isamu went to his CIP and brought out a single, perfect iron fishhook, holding it up so it glinted in the weak sunlight. He then mimed the act of catching a fish. Dax's eyes, which had been so reserved, sharpened with interest. He gestured for one of his men to come forward. The man brought a reindeer pelt, holding it up. The fur was incredibly thick, a dense, gray-brown that promised immense warmth. Isamu nodded, but then held up a single finger, shaking his head. He pointed from the hook to the pelt, then held up two fingers, then pointed at the pelt again. "One hook is not enough for this pelt. I need two pelts for one hook." Daxa frowned, understanding the negation. He shook his head, took the pelt, and stroked it emphatically, then pointed at the hook and held up a single, firm finger. "The quality of this pelt is worth one hook." The negotiation continued for what felt like hours, moving from fishhooks to a small steel hatchet to bolts of cotton cloth. It was a complex, wordless dance of value and desire. There were moments of frustration where both sides threw their hands up in exasperation. But there were also moments of breakthrough, a shared grunt of agreement, a nod of mutual respect when a fair trade was finally struck. They were learning each other's language, not of words, but of worth. As the sun began to dip towards the western mountains, painting the stark landscape in hues of orange and violet, Daxa made a different gesture. He pointed to Isamu, then to his own chest, then to a clearing beyond the beach where smoke curled into the twilight air. He mimed eating, an invitation. Cautiously, Isamu and his men followed the Nifk into their settlement. It was different from an Ainu kotan. The dwellings were conical tents, calms, made of reindeer skins stretched over a frame of long poles. The air was thick with the smells of smoking fish, burning animal fat, and the distinct, pungent aroma of the Nifk themselves. Inside Dax's calm, around a central fire pit, The final barriers began to fall. They shared food. The Ainu offered their dried salmon cakes and sea urchin roe. The Nifk offered strips of smoked seal meat, which had a strong, gamey flavor that was initially challenging, and a sour, fermented drink made from roots that warmed the belly. They ate with their hands, the universal language of hunger and hospitality. After the meal, Daxa pointed to the intricate spiral patterns on his Samu's emusher knife sheath. He made a questioning sound. Isamu, understanding, pointed to the swirling designs on Dax's own sealskin boots. He then pointed to the forest around them, miming the wind swirling through the trees. Our patterns come from the spirits of nature. Daxa looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. He pointed to the designs on his boots, then to the reindeer skins of the tent, then to the sky, making a sweeping gesture that encompassed the stars beginning to prick through the smoke hole. Our patterns come from the animals and the heavens. In that moment, sitting in the fire-lit gloom of the skin tent, surrounded by the smells of a foreign world, Isamu felt a profound connection that transcended trade. They were not the same. Their languages were different. Their gods had different names. Their homes were built from different materials. But they were the same in what mattered. They were both people of the land who understood that patterns had meaning, that animals were to be respected, and that survival was a sacred pact with the world around them. He had not found a mirror of his own culture, but he had found its echo in a different tongue. The story he was bringing back would not be one of conquest or mere commerce, but one of recognition. They were not alone. The days spent in the Neef settlement were a lesson in a different kind of survival, one etched not in the gentle, forgiving greens of Hokkaido's forests, but in the stark, monumental palette of stone, sea, and sky. Isamu and his men were students in a world where the margins for error were vanishingly small. The Ainu were masters of the forest and the coastal current. The Nifk were lords of the open taiga and the ice-choked sea. Each skill the Ainu possessed was met with a parallel, yet fundamentally different, mastery from their hosts. The morning after their arrival, Daxa led Isamu and Mako, the sharp-eyed hunter, away from the camp. He did not head towards the shore, but inland, following a game trail that wound through stunted pines and across spongy, moss-covered tundra. The air was bitingly cold, and a fine mist clung to the low-lying areas. Daxa moved with a rolling, ground-eating gait, his eyes constantly scanning the landscape, reading signs invisible to the Ainu. He stopped abruptly, kneeling by a patch of soft earth. He pointed to a faint, three-toed impression. Kuktu'i grunted, "Sable." He then showed them his snare. It was not the simple loop of cordage the Ainu might use for rabbits. It was a clever, brutal mechanism of bent saplings, sinew, and carved bone triggers. Daxa explained its principle through gesture. The sable's delicate leg would brush the trigger, releasing the sapling's tension and snapping the noose tight around its body, killing it instantly. The efficiency of it was breathtaking. But to Isamu, it also felt impersonal, a far cry from the respectful, direct engagement of the Ainu spear hunt. It was a transaction with the trap, not the animal. Later, it was Isamu's turn. He led Daxa and two of his hunters to a fast-moving, crystal-clear river that tumbled down from the mountains. The Ainu method of fishing was an art of profound patience and precise reading of the water. Isamu stood on a midstream boulder, his body perfectly still, his spear held loosely. He was not just looking for fish. He was listening to the river's song, watching how the current fractured around rocks, creating eddies and quiet pools where the salmon would rest. He pointed, showing Daxa the subtle shadow, the flash of a silver flank in the depths. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, in a movement too fast for the eye to follow, the spear flashed down and emerged with a thrashing, 5-pound salmon impaled just behind the gills. It was not luck. It was the culmination of a lifetime of learning the language of pet Kamui. Daxa watched, his expression unreadable. He then took his own harpoon, a longer, heavier weapon tipped with a viciously barbed point of walrus ivory. He did not wait in stillness. He waded into the water, his movements creating a deliberate disturbance. When a large fish darted from its hiding place, he did not strike with the pinpoint accuracy of the Samu. Instead, he threw the harpoon with immense, brute force, the attached line whipping out behind it. It was less a precise kill and more an overwhelming assault, trusting the barbed point to find its mark and hold fast. The two methods were a perfect reflection of their worlds. The Ainu's subtle, spiritual negotiation and the Neef's direct, powerful claim. The true bonding, however, happened not in the hunt, but in the quiet hours. One evening, as they sat around the fire inside Dax's calm, the wind howling outside like a pack of hungry wolves, Isamu noticed a small, crudely carved wooden figure near the entrance. It was an abstract representation of a bear, its form heavy and powerful. He pointed to it, then to himself, and made the sign for Kimun Kamui, the mountain god. Dax's eyes lit with understanding. He nodded vigorously. He went to a leather bag and pulled out a bear skull, carefully cleaned and polished. He held it with reverence. He then began a low, guttural chant, his voice a stark contrast to the melodic, flowing yucca of the Ainu. It was harsh, rhythmic, and powerful. He mimed the hunt, the kill, and then a feast. He pointed to the skull and then to the sky. The message was clear. They too honor the bear. They too had a sending back ceremony. But the differences were profound. The Neef ceremony, as Daxa pantomimed it, seemed shorter, more focused on the practical celebration of the kill and the safe passage of the spirit, lacking the multi-day, elaborate host and guest ritual of the Ainu Ayamat. It was another echo, similar in theme, but different in its music. Isamu felt a swelling of emotion in his chest. Here, at the edge of the world, the divine ruler of the mountains was still acknowledged, still feared, and still revered. The sacred thread, though woven differently, was unbroken. On their final morning, as the Ainu prepared their CIPS for the long journey south, Daxa approached Isamu. He was holding something wrapped in soft sealskin. He unwrapped it carefully. It was a knife, but it was unlike any Isamu had ever seen. The blade was not steel or obsidian, but a shard of dark, glossy stone, flaked with incredible skill to a razor edge that seemed to drink the light. It was obsidian, but of a quality and color unique to this northern land. The hilt was carved from a single piece of yellowed walrus ivory, intricately etched with patterns of swimming fish, and Isamu realized with a start, a stylized Ainu spiral, a design Daxa must have seen on his gear and memorized. It was not an item for trade. It was a gift, a recognition. Daxa placed it in Isamu's hands and then closed his own large, calloused hands over them. He looked directly into Isamu's eyes and spoke a single, clear sentence in his own tone, the meaning unmistakable. "You're my brother." Isamu was speechless. The weight of the knife, of the gesture, of the shared understanding was immense. He had come seeking a story to heal his people's spirit, and he was returning with a physical token of that healing. A bond forged not in easy friendship, but in hard-earned mutual respect. He nodded, his throat too tight for words, and placed his own hand over his heart. The journey back was undertaken with a new spirit. The sea was no less formidable, the fog no less disorienting, but a fire now burned in Isamu's chest. As the familiar green mountains of Ainu finally emerged from the haze, he did not see a broken, grieving Khotan. He saw people who were part of something larger. They were not just victims of a changing world. They were a point on a vast, human map that stretched from the smoking islands of the south to the frozen taiga of the north. They had something unique to offer, a spiritual depth that even the formidable Neef recognized. The story he would tell was not one of escape, but of reconnection. They had been looking down at their wounds for too long. It was time to look up and remember the vastness of the sky they all lived under. The promise he carried was not just in the valuable furs and ivory in the hull of a CP, but in the dark, glossy blade tucked safely against his chest, a reminder that even in a world of encroaching shadows, new light could be found in the most unexpected places. The return of the CIPS was not a triumphant roar, but a quiet affirmation that seeped into the bones of the Khotan like a slow, warm rain after a long drought. The sight of the three familiar vessels emerging from the sea haze sent a ripple through the settlement, a cautious unfurling of hope. The men who waded ashore were thinner, their faces gaunt and weathered by sun and salt, but they stood differently. Their shoulders were squared not with arrogance, but with a quiet confidence earned in a foreign land. They moved with the weary grace of men who had stared into the unknown and had not been found wanting. Isamu's first act was not to display his treasures, but to walk directly to his mother's chais. Aina stood in the doorway, her hands still dusty from grinding millet, her eyes set deep in their web of wrinkles, searching his face. She saw the new lines around his eyes, the grim set of his mouth that had softened around the edges, and the profound, settled calm in his gaze. She did not embrace him. Instead, she reached out and touched the new, ivory-hilted knife at his belt, her fingers tracing the unfamiliar Neef carvings alongside the Ainu spiral. It was a language she did not speak, but its meaning was clear. Her son had not just traveled. He had been transformed. "The wind from the north has changed you," she said, her voice a dry rustle. "It has reminded me of who we are, Mother," he replied, his voice low. "It has shown me that we are not a fading echo. We are one note in a great song." That evening, the entire Khotan gathered in the central clearing. A great fire was lit, its flames pushing back the creeping chill of the twilight. For the first time since the plague, the atmosphere was not heavy with grief, but electric with a tense, hopeful anticipation. The children, who had grown used to a world of hushed voices and somber faces, fidgeted with a nervous excitement they barely understood. Isamu did not stand to give a speech. He sat on a worn bear pelt near the fire, the place of the storyteller. His men sat with him, their presence a silent testament to the truth of his words. He began not with the journey itself, but with the feeling of it, the oppressive fog, the terrifying vastness of the open sea, the moment of landfall on that alien, stony shore. He described the Neef not as caricatures, but as a people in meticulous, respectful detail. He spoke of Dax's flinty eyes and his ground-eating walk. He described the calms, the skin tints that smelled of smoke and animal fat, so different from their own earthy chais. He held up the new knife, letting the firelight play on the glossy obsidian blade. "They are masters of the stone and the ice," he said, his voice gaining strength. "Their traps are clever, their harpoons are strong. They are not weak." And they looked at us, not as strange little men from the south, but as equals. They saw the quality of our CIPS, the sharpness of our eyes on the water, the fine work of our touch cloth. He then launched into a masterful pantomime, recreating the wordless barter on the beach. He played both parts, his body becoming first the proud, reserved Daxa, holding up a magnificent reindeer pelt, then himself, the shrewd Isamu, examining it with a critical eye and holding up a single iron fishhook with a skeptical frown. The performance was so vivid, so filled with humor and intelligence, that a ripple of laughter went through the crowd, a sound that had been absent for so long it felt almost sacrilegious. He was showing them that their Ainu cleverness, their understanding of value and negotiation, had value and power in the wider world. But the heart of his story, the part that hushed the laughter and made the elders lean forward, was the bear. He described the small wooden figure in Dax's tent, the polished skull brought out with reverence. His voice dropped, taking on the resonant, chanting quality of the euchre. "They know Kimun Kamui," he said, the words falling into a profound silence. "They call him by a different name, in a tongue that is hard and sharp like the north wind. But they know him. They honor his strength. They thank him for his flesh and his fur. They send his spirit back to the mountain." He looked around the circle, meeting the eyes of the old hunters, seeing the stunned recognition there. We are not alone in this. The thread that connects us to the sacred world, it does not end at our shores. It stretches north across the sea. It is woven differently there. The pattern is not the same as ours, but the thread is the same. The God is the same. This revelation was a seismic shift. The isolation they had felt, the sense that their world and their gods were shrinking under the pressure from the south, was shattered. Their faith was not a small, local superstition. It was part of a larger, continental truth. Finally, the goods were brought forth. The thick reindeer pelts were passed around, their incredible warmth marveled at. The walrus ivory, smooth and heavy, was handled with awe. But these material things were now secondary. They were proof, tangible evidence of the deeper, spiritual truth Isamu had brought home. Later, as the feast died down and the stars wheeled overhead, Isamu found Sam, the old chief, sitting alone by the embers of the fire. Sam's hands, gnarled and twisted with age, were resting on his knees. He looked up at Isamu, his eyes reflecting the dying firelight. "You have brought back more than furs and ivory, Isamu," the old man said, his voice thin but clear. "You have brought back a mirror. In it, I do not see a people who are dying. I see a people who had forgotten how vast they are." He was silent for a long moment. The Wajan, they see the world as a thing to be owned, divided, and sold. The Nifk, and we Ainu, we see it as a thing to be lived within. We speak the same language, you and I and Daxa. It is a language the Wajan have never learned. Isamu nodded, the weight of the journey and its meaning finally settling upon him. He had gone north to escape the shadow of the south, and he had found a torch to fight it with. The story was now theirs to keep. The song of the Ainu had found a harmony in the north, and in doing so, its own melody had grown stronger, more resilient, more defiant. The Khotan was no longer an empty vessel of grief. It was a repository of a renewed and expanded legacy. The renewed spirit brought back from the north was a fragile sapling, needing careful tending in the harsh soil of their new reality. Isamu's story had rekindled a sense of pride, but it could not stop the relentless tide of change flowing from the south. The Wajan trading post at the river's mouth was no longer a seasonal curiosity. It had solidified into a permanent settlement, a small, bustling village of wooden buildings with tiled roofs that stood in stark geometric opposition to the organic curves of the Ainu Khotan. More settlers arrived on every ship, their numbers seeming to multiply with each passing season. The relationship, once a cautious barter between two different worlds, was now an undeniable hierarchy. The Wajan official, a stern man named Kato who had replaced the traitor Jinsuk, no longer offered gifts or engaged in lengthy negotiations. He posted lists of fixed prices. A sea otter pelt was worth a specific measure of rice. A bundle of dried salmon was worth a set number of iron nails. There was no room for the old dance of value, for the subtle communication of respect that had once been part of the trade. It was a cold, impersonal calculus, and the Ainu were always on the losing side of the equation. Worse than the economic pressure was the cultural suffocation. Kato, armed with the authority of the Matsumi domain, began to enforce the first of the assimilation edicts, not with violent force, but with a bureaucratic relentlessness that was somehow more insidious. He summoned Isamu and the other elders to the post's main building, a long, low structure that smelled of ink and sawdust. The Ainu language is a barrier to progress and loyalty, Kato stated, his voice flat, reading from a scroll as an interpreter translated. Children must be taught in Japanese. It is the language of the emperor and of civilization. You will speak it in your dealings with us. In time, you will speak it in your homes. The words landed like a physical blow. To forbid their language was to forbid their stories, their prayers, their very thoughts. It was to silence the yukur, to sever the vocal cord that connected them to their ancestors. The elders returned to the Khotan in a state of stunned silence. That evening, the familiar melodic flow of Ainu speech was hushed, replaced by a self-conscious, fearful quiet. Parents looked at their children with a new, terrible anxiety. It was in this atmosphere of quiet dread that the women of the Khotan became the silent guardians of their culture. Led by Aina, whose hands were now gnarled with arthritis, but whose will was iron, they adapted their age-old arts into acts of subtle rebellion. The intricate patterns they wove into their atush cloth and embroidered onto their garments took on a new, clandestine significance. Gathered in Ina's chais, the air thick with the scent of boiling bark for dye, the women worked their looms and needles. Ina held up a nearly finished robe, her finger tracing the swirling moru pattern around the cuff. "See this?" she said to her granddaughter, Tomo, and the other young girls. The Wajins see only decoration. They do not know that this spiral is the path of the river god, Pet Kamui. They do not know that these sharp angles, the Aius, are thorns to protect the wearer's spirit from harm. She pointed to a series of interlocking diamonds near the collar. This is the scale of the fish, a prayer for abundance. This, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper as she traced a complex pattern of lines and dots, is a map of the stars as they were on the night you were born, Tomo. It is your story woven into the cloth. They can forbid us from speaking our name, but they cannot forbid the thread from holding our history. This was how they would fight, not with spears, which would be suicide, but with thread and memory. They would weave their prayers into tunics, stitch their clan histories into leggings, embroider their maps of the hunting grounds on his ceremonial robes. Their culture would become a secret language, worn on their very bodies, hidden in plain sight from the Wajin who saw their art as mere primitive craft. The men, too, found their own forms of quiet resistance. The great communal Ayamant was now forbidden, a public ceremony deemed barbaric. But the hunt for the bear, the sacred negotiation with Kimon Kamui, could not be so easily erased from their hearts. The hunters, led by Isamu and his son Kenji, now a man grown, would go into the deepest, most remote parts of the forest. There, far from any wagon road or settlement, they would perform a silent, stripped-down version of the ritual. After a successful hunt, they would not bring the entire bear back to the Khotan. They would butcher it in the forest, taking the meat and hide, but carefully cleaning the skull. In a hidden clearing, they would place the skull on a bed of moss, surrounded by a simple ring of uncarved Ainu. There would be no chanting, no dancing, no days of feasting. Only a few moments of profound silence, a few whispered words of gratitude sent directly from their hearts to the spirit of the mountain. Then they would leave, the sacred transaction complete, the balance momentarily restored, their defiance unseen by any human eyes but their own. These acts were not victories. They were holding actions a desperate, rearguard battle against the erosion of their soul. The Khotan was changing. More Japanese words peppered the speech of the young. The beautiful, labored process of making a tush cloth was slowly being abandoned for the cheap, readily available wagon cotton. But deep in the forest, in the secret patterns of a grandmother's embroidery, and in the silent prayers of hunters in a moonlit clearing, the heart of the Ainu still beat. It was a quieter beat, a more fearful one, but it was stubborn. They were learning the hardest lesson of all, how to bend like the willow in a storm so that their core would not break, waiting for a day when they could stand straight again. The seasons turned, each cycle carving a little more of the old world away. The snows of winter melted into the hesitant green of spring, but the renewal felt hollow, a performance for an audience that no longer cared for the play. The true marker of time was no longer the run of the salmon or the blooming of the kitapuro, but the arrival of another official decree from the Matsumi domain, delivered by Kato with the grim finality of a stone dropping into a well. This time, he did not summon the elders to his office. He came to them, marching into the heart of the Khotan with 2 armed guards, their presence a cold, metallic shock amidst the familiar earth and wood. The villagers stopped their work, their hands stilling on looms and fishing nets, their eyes wide with a dread they had come to know well. Children were pulled close, hushed into silence. Kato unrolled a scroll, the parchment crackling in the tense air. The interpreter, a man who now looked perpetually ashamed, cleared his throat. By the order of the shogunate and the Matsumi domain, the following practices of the Ainu people are hereby abolished as uncivilized and an impediment to integration. His voice was a monotone, trying to drain the words of their terrible meaning. The tattooing of women is forbidden. The bear ceremony, known as Iamant, is forbidden. The use of Ainu names is forbidden. All Ainu shall adopt standard Japanese names henceforth. A collective, sharp intake of breath hissed through the crowd. Forbidden their names. It was one thing to be told not to speak their language in public, another to be told their very identities were illegal. A name was not just a sound. It was a story, a prayer, a connection to an ancestor, to a moment of birth, to the spirit of a natural phenomenon. Isamu was not just a Samu. He was the one who conquers the waves, a name earned by his father after a legendary fishing haul. Aina meant budding flower, given for her birth in the first thaw. To lose their names was to be spiritually orphaned, cut adrift from the chain of being that connected them to their past. But it was the outlawing of the tattoos that struck the most intimate and visible blow. The women, in particular, felt it like a physical violation. Ina's hand instinctively went to the dark blue lines that spidered around her lips and traveled down her hands. The marks of her womanhood, her strength, her spiritual connectivity. She looked at her granddaughter, Tomo, a girl on the cusp of womanhood, her face smooth and unmarked. The lineage, the visible proof of Ainu womanhood, would end with her generation. The sacred ritual that connected grandmother to granddaughter, that inscribed their identity onto their very skin, was now a crime. Cato's eyes scanned the crowd, cold and impersonal. They landed on Isamu. "You," he said, pointing a finger. "Your name is now Cato." He used his own surname, an act of profound domination, of ownership. He then pointed to Isamu's son. "Kenji, you are now Sato." He went down the line, bestowing common Japanese names like slapping brands on cattle. Tanaka, Watanabe, Kobayashi. The beautiful, melodic Ainu names, Rara, Wind, Parika, Beautiful, Shirokanipe, Silver Droplet, were wiped away in a moment, replaced by harsh, guttural syllables that felt like stones in their mouths. The ceremony of renaming was a grotesque pantomime. Cato had them line up. As he barked a new name, the interpreter would hand the person a small, wooden tag with the characters carved into it. Isamu, now Cato, stared at the tag in his hand. The characters Jatung meant nothing to him. They were empty shapes, a cage for his soul. He looked at his son, Kenji, now Sato, and saw the shame and confusion warring in the young man's eyes. The pride of the northern voyage, the confidence of the trader, had been shattered, replaced by the humiliation of a man who has been told his very existence is an error to be corrected. That night, the Khotan was a place of silent, suffocating grief. There were no wails of mourning, for even their sorrow felt forbidden. Inside the chais, families sat in the dim firelight, the new name tags lying on the floor like poisonous insects. Tomo looked at her grandmother, Aina, her eyes filled with tears. "Grandmother," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Will they come and scrub your face?" Aina reached out, her tattooed hand, now a forbidden artifact, cupping her granddaughter's smooth cheek. The contrast was a painful illustration of the edict. "No, little one," she said, her voice thick. "The marks are my skin and in my soul. They cannot take what is inside. They can only forbid what is outside." She looked at the empty space around Tomo's lips, the future that would never be inscribed. "You will carry the marks differently. You will carry them here." She tapped Tomo's chest over her heart, and here she tapped her own temple. "You must remember the patterns. You must remember what they mean. That will be your rebellion." Outside, Isamu stood in the darkness, the wooden Cato tag burning a hole in his palm. He looked up at the stars, the same stars that had guided him to the Neefkin back. The Kamui of the sky were still there. The mountain was still there. The Wajan could change his name. They could forbid his ceremonies, but they could not change the fact that he was of this land, and it was of him. The weight of the new name was immense, an anchor trying to drag him down into oblivion. But as he stood there, the cold night air filling his lungs, he made a silent vow. He would carry the name Cato like a prisoner wears chains. He would answer to it, but in his heart, where the Kamui could hear, he would always be Isamu. The conquest was not over. It had just moved to a new, internal battlefield, a war for the soul fought in the silent, secret spaces of their own minds. The new names were not the end, but the beginning of a deeper, more systematic unraveling. The edicts were like a slow-acting poison, and the next symptom was a fever that attacked the very land beneath their feet. Men from the Matsumi domain, armed with maps and measuring chains, arrived in the Khotan. They did not come to trade or to deliver pronouncements. They came to draw lines on the world, to impose a grid of ownership upon a landscape that had always been a shared, living entity. They spoke a new, terrifying vocabulary. Koku for yield, Cho for measurement, Ba for location. They pointed to the forests where the Ainu had hunted for generations, the rivers where they had fished, the clearings where they had gathered medicinal herbs. This is now designated logging land for the Matsumi domain. The surveyor, a pinched-faced man with ink-stained fingers, declared through the interpreter, "That river is reserved for the new Weijin fishing cooperative. This plot here," he gestured to the land their Khotan stood upon, "is to be redistributed for rice cultivation." The words were abstract, but their meaning was brutally concrete. They were being evicted from their own history. The forest, Kinakanop, was no longer a spiritual elder to be respected, but a resource to be exploited. The river, Pet Kamui, was no longer a god to be appeased, but a utility to be harnessed. The land was no longer their mother. It was now a commodity, and they were squatters on it. Isamu, now known as Kato in all official dealings, stood with the other men, watching as the surveyors drove wooden stakes into the earth, marking the boundaries of their new, constricted world. The proposed redistributed plot was a poor, stony piece of land farther up the mountain, away from the river, with thin soil and little game. It was a place meant for failure. "We cannot live there," Isamu said, his voice low and hard. "The soil is weak. The game is scarce. It is a place of hunger." The surveyor did not even look up from his map. "Then you will learn to be better farmers," he said dismissively, "or you will find work in the Weijin fishing cooperative. Your traditional ways are inefficient. This is progress." The word progress tasted like ash. It meant the clear cutting of an ancient forest, the sound of a 1,000-year-old tree crashing down a brutal, final sound that echoed for days. It meant the construction of a weir across the river, blocking the salmon from their spawning grounds, an act of such profound sacrilege that the older Ainu wept openly by the riverbank. It meant the arrival of Weijin farmers with their oxen and plows, turning the wild, spirit-filled meadows into geometric rows of alien rice plants. Faced with starvation or submission, the Khotan fractured. Some families, broken in spirit and desperate for survival, accepted the new plots. They tried to mimic the Weijin farmers, their hands clumsy with the plow, their hearts aching as they tried to force the land to conform to a foreign will. The yield was meager, their existence a humiliating parody of their former selves. Others, like Isamu and his family, made a different choice. They would not be penned. They would not become peasants on the ruins of their own world. It was Kenji, now Sato, who first voiced the unthinkable. He had been on a trading mission to the interior, to the rugged, mountainous heart of Hokkaido, lands the Weijin had not yet bothered to survey or claim because they were deemed too difficult for farming. "Father," he said one evening, his face grim, "there are places they do not want. Deep valleys, high mountains. The land is too steep for their rice, the forests too dense for their logging. The Kamui there are still strong because the Weijin are weak there." The decision to leave was the most painful of Isamu's life. This Khotan was the only home he had ever known. The bones of his ancestors were buried here. The spirits of this specific place, the particular rock formation that was a Kamui, the ancient willow by the stream, were part of his soul. To leave was a kind of amputation. The exodus was carried out in the dead of night, under a sliver of a moon, as if they were criminals fleeing a crime they did not commit. They took only what they could carry, their sacred Ainu, the ancestral emusure swords, the precious rolls of a tush cloth woven with their hidden histories, and the meager food they had stored. They did not look back at the empty chais, the hearths gone cold. The sound of their footsteps was swallowed by the forest. their grief a silent offering to the kamui of the home they were abandoning. They traveled for days, moving like ghosts through a landscape that was both familiar and newly terrifying. They were refugees in their own land. They followed game trails known only to the oldest hunters, fording icy rivers and climbing treacherous passes. Finally, they reached the place Kenji had described, a high, hidden valley cradle between two sheer mountain peaks. A fast, clear river ran through it, and the forest was old and deep, teeming with game. It was a fortress of nature. Here they would build a new Khotan. It would be poorer, harder. Their chives would be smaller, their lives more precarious. But as Isamu stood on a promontory, looking down at the untouched valley, he felt a flicker of the old feeling. Here, the air was clean of the wagon scent of smoke and industry. Here, the only laws were the laws of the kamui. They were wounded, they were diminished, but they were free. They had traded the comfort of their ancestral home for the brutal, precious gift of remaining Ainu. As the first rays of the sun touched the highest peak, igniting it in fire, he whispered his true name into the wind, a secret defiance for the mountain gods alone to hear. The silent exodus was over. The hidden resistance had begun. The first winter in the hidden valley was a gauntlet of pure survival, a brutal reacquaintance with the fundamental, unforgiving laws of nature, stripped of the comforts and accumulated knowledge of their ancestral home. The chives they built were crude, hurried constructions, their frames of green with still sweating sap, their roofs a patchwork of sod and bark that leaked melting snow. The central hearths, the apahusi, were small and smoky, their heat a feeble defiance against the Arctic winds that howled down from the mountain peaks, scouring the valley with a breath that promised oblivion. They had named this place Shin Khotan, the new village, but the name felt like a plea, a hope whispered against the overwhelming evidence of their hardship. Isamu, his body aching with a cold that seemed to have settled deep in his bones, led the hunting parties. The game here was different, warier, less accustomed to man. The tracks of the deer were lighter, more fleeting. The great Hokkaido brown bear, Kimon Kamui, was a ghost, its presence felt in the overturned rocks and the powerful scent on the wind, but remained unseen, a sovereign observing the desperate newcomers in his kingdom. The hunts were long, often fruitless treks through deep snow that sapped the spirit as much as the body. They returned to the Shin Khotan more often with empty hands and grim faces than with life-sustaining meat. The silence of their return a heavier burden than any carcass. It was the wisdom of the elders, particularly the women like Ainu, that became their most vital resource. With their stored seeds and traditional food caches left behind, they were forced to rely entirely on the land's immediate winter bear generosity. Ainu, wrapped in layers of warnatush, would lead foraging parties, her eyes, still sharp despite her age, scanning the snowy landscape. She taught the younger women and children to find the secret caches of nuts buried by squirrels, to dig through the snow for the frozen yet edible roots of the gobo, burdock, and to identify the leathery, persistent leaves of certain plants that could be boiled into a bitter but nutritious tea. Her knowledge, once one thread in the rich tapestry of their culture, was now a lifeline. Every root dug up, every handful of nuts retrieved, was a small victory in a war against starvation. Kenji, who had once measured wealth in iron kettles and bags of rice, now found a different kind of value. His trading skills were useless here. There was no one to trade with. Instead, he applied his cleverness to survival. He devised more efficient fish traps for the river, now frozen over, requiring them to chop holes in the thick ice. He organized a few able-bodied men into a rotating watch, not for human enemies, but for the signs of wolves, whose packs, growing bold with hunger, circled the Shin-Koten at night, their howls a chilling chorus that spoke of a world still ruled by tooth and claw. The spiritual life of the community, once so rich and public, was forced into a deeper, more personal intimacy. The great Ayamant was a memory, a story told in hushed tones by the fire. There were no bears to hunt, and even if there were, they lacked the resources for the ceremony. But the need to connect with the Kamui was more acute than ever. One night, during the deepest cold of the winter, when the air itself seemed to crackle and the stars were like frozen chips of ice, an old hunter named Ben began to chant. It was not a formal euchre, but a personal, improvised plea, his voice a raw, cracked thing in the darkness of his chais. "Oh, Kimun Kamui of these new mountains," he chanted, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "We are strangers in your realm. We mean no disrespect. We ask for your understanding. Our bellies are empty, our children are cold. Guide the deer to our spears." Seasons turned. The solitary man, who had come to think of himself as Okikirmi, the one who listens, and the woman, whom he called Shiromi, the quiet one, build a life together. Their first, crude lean-to evolved into a pit house, dug partially into the earth for warmth, with a frame of young trees and a roof of sod and bark. It was a humble chais, but it was a home. The central hearth, the Apahusi, became the literal and spiritual center of their world. Their communication began with gestures and shared tasks, but soon blossomed into a true language, born from the world around them. The word for river, pet, was the sound of water gurgling over stones. The word for wind, rera, was the sighing of the pines. Their vocabulary was a lexicon of the land, each syllable rooted in the earth, the water, the sky. They did not have a word for war, for the concept was alien. They had many words for snow. Yupis for new snow, Apkas for settled snow, Conru for hard, crusty snow, because understanding snow was a matter of life and death. Their family grew. First one child, a boy with a loud, demanding cry, then a girl with eyes as dark and deep as a forest pool. With children came the need for more than mere survival. It brought the need for culture, for meaning, for ritual. Okikirmi was a skilled hunter. He had learned to read the forest like a scroll. He could follow the faintest scratch on bark that marked a bear's passage, could interpret the meaning behind a broken twig, could smell the musky scent of a deer on the wind. One autumn, he tracked a great Hokkaido brown bear, Kimun Kamui, the god who rules the mountains. It was a massive creature, its fur a shaggy cloak of dark brown, its power evident in every ripple of its shoulder muscles. To hunt such a being was not an act of violence. It was a sacred undertaking. The hunt lasted for days. Okikirmi followed the bear not with aggression, but with a respectful distance, observing its habits, its dignity. "Soften your winter breath upon us. We offer you our respect, for it is all we have left to give." He had no Ainu to offer, so he took a sliver of his own precious food, a piece of dried fish, and placed it in the fire, a sacrifice of his own sustenance to the spirit of the mountain. Others in the Koten, hearing his chant, took up their own quiet prayers. There was no communal ritual, no shared feast. It was a scattering of individual, desperate conversations with the divine, a network of silent pleas rising from the snowbound valley. It was faith stripped to its barest essence, not a celebration, but a negotiation from a position of profound weakness. The turning point came not with a dramatic event, but with a slow, gradual shift. As the relentless grip of winter began to loosen by imperceptible degrees, a hunter, following a set of faint tracks that Ben's prayer had perhaps guided him to, managed to bring down alone aging deer. It was not a magnificent stag, but its meat was a deliverance. The following week, Kenji's ice fishing traps yielded a surprising bounty of fat, sluggish river fish. It felt to the entire Shinkotan like a response. The kamui of this new land had tested them, had pushed them to the very brink of their endurance, and finding them still respectful, still persistent in their prayers, had finally chosen to relent. When the first brave green shoots pushed through the retreating snow, a fragile, hard-won sense of accomplishment settled over the Shinkotan. They were thinner, wearier, and had lost two of their oldest to the cold. But they were alive. They had passed the test. The valley was no longer a hostile fortress. It was becoming a sanctuary. They had not just survived the winter. They had earned the right to call this hidden place home. The land had accepted their offering of suffering and resilience, and in return, it was offering them a future. Spring in the hidden valley was not a gentle awakening, but a violent, glorious explosion of life. The snow retreated, revealing a land of breathtaking, untamed beauty. The river, once a silent ribbon under ice, became a roaring, milty torrent fed by the melting snows from the high peaks. The forests erupted in a cacophony of birdsong and the vibrant, almost aggressive green of new growth. For the people of Shinkotan, it was a deliverance. The foraging grounds Aina had identified were now abundant with fiddlehead ferns, wild onions, and 100 other edible plants she named for the children, passing on the knowledge that was now their most vital currency. But with survival momentarily assured, a deeper anxiety began to gnaw at Isamu. He walked through the new Kotan, watching the children, his own grandchildren among them, at play. They were healthy, their cheeks flushed with the mountain air. They spoke in the Ainu language, their voices a sweet, melodic sound in the clear air. But what did they know? They had never witnessed the grandeur of the Ayamat. They had never seen a woman receive the sacred tattoos that marked her as a guardian of their culture. Their world was this valley, a beautiful but bounded universe. The great epic poems, the Euchre, that contained their history, their laws, and their connection to the Kamui, were silent. The elders who held them were dying, one by one, and with them, the memory of who the Ainu truly were. One evening, he found his mother, Aina, sitting outside her chais, her hands, now permanently curled like the roots of an ancient tree, slowly, painstakingly, weaving a basket of willow strands. Her eyes were fixed on the children playing a game of tag, their laughter echoing against the mountains. Their laughter is a good sound, Isamu, she said, not turning to look at him. But laughter is not memory. A song forgotten is a world lost. I know, mother, he replied, his voice heavy. Ben is the last who knows the full Euchre of the Owl God. When he is gone, who will teach it? The children know the words for river and bear, but do they know the Kamui within them? Aina, stop her weaving. She looked at him, her dark eyes holding a fierce, unwavering light. Then we must become the keepers of the echoes. We cannot perform the old ceremonies, but we can tell the stories of them. We cannot tattoo the skin, but we can tattoo the soul. This became the new, sacred work of Shinkotan. It was a conscious, deliberate project of cultural preservation, a secret school held in the dappled sunlight of the forest and the flickering firelight of the chais. Ben, the old hunter, though his body was failing, found a new purpose. He gathered the children around him not as a hunter, but as a living library. His voice, once strong enough to carry across a valley, was now a reedy whisper, but it held a power that silenced the most restless child. He did not simply tell the stories, he performed them. As he began the euchre of the owl god, his hands would tremble, transforming into wings. His eyes would grow wide, capturing the bird's piercing gaze. He used the old, repetitive phrases, Shirokanipe Ranran Pishkin for the shimmering droplet, weaving a hypnotic soundscape that transported his young listeners to the mystical plains where gods and animals spoke as one. He taught them not just the stories, but the feel of them, the rhythm that was the heartbeat of their people. Alongside this, Aina and the other women began a different kind of instruction. While they wove their atush cloth or prepared meals, they told the children the hidden meanings in their embroidery. This is not just a pattern, Aina would say, pointing to a swirling design on a tunic. This is the path of the soul after it leaves the body, a map for the spirit to find its way to the ancestors. She showed them how to identify every plant, not just as food or medicine, but as a being with its own spirit and story. The forest became a classroom, every tree and stone a textbook. Isamu and Kenji took the older boys on long walks, teaching them to track, but layering the practical skill with spiritual meaning. When you follow the deer, Isamu instructed his grandson, Hanto, you are not chasing meat. You are engaging in a conversation with Yukkor Kamui, the deer god. The tracks are his words. The broken twig is his punctuation. You must listen with your eyes and your heart, not just your stomach. It was a race against time and forgetting. Every story told, every pattern explained, every prayer whispered was a brick in a fragile wall they were building against the tide of oblivion. The children of Shinkoden would grow up in a world without the external markers of their culture. No grand bear ceremonies, no tattooed faces. But internally, they were being fortified. They were learning that to be Ainu was not about the performance, but about the perception. It was a way of seeing the world, a way of listening to the wind and understanding that it carried the voices of the Kamui. One night, as the community shared a meal of fresh spring greens and roasted fish, little Hanto, who had been unusually quiet, looked up at Ben. "Grandfather," he said, his small voice clear in the firelight. "Can you teach me the chant? The one for the bear?" Ben's old eyes filled with tears. He nodded, a slow, solemn gesture. And so, under a canopy of stars unseen by the Wajan, in a hidden valley that did not exist on any of their maps, the old man began to teach the boy the first lines of the prayer that would send the spirit of Kimun Kamui back to the mountain. The echo was being captured, not in ink or on parchment, but in the heart of a child. The song was not dying. It was being passed on, a whisper from one generation to the next, ensuring that even if the world never saw their ceremonies again, the Ainu would never forget how to sing them. The isolation of a Shinkoden was a double-edged sword. It was their protection, a veil of obscurity that kept the Wajan world at bay. But it was also a silence, a severance from the wider tapestry of their people. They were a single, stubborn thread, but they had no knowledge of the larger pattern or if the fabric of the Ainu world was unraveling elsewhere. This silence was broken one late summer day by the sound of a single, weary traveler stumbling into their clearing. He was a specter of a man, emaciated and clad in rags that had once been fine atush cloth. His feet were wrapped in bloody strips of hide, and his eyes held a hollow, haunted look that Isamu recognized from the years after the plague. The man collapsed at the edge of the village, and it took the combined efforts of Kenji and another hunter to carry him into Ainu's chais. As they laid him by the hearth, the man's gaze fell upon Ainu's tattooed lips and hands, and a sound escaped him, a choked sob of recognition and grief. They gave him water and a thin broth, and his strength slowly returned to his body. His story poured out in a rasping, desperate torrent. His name was Rera, and he had come from a Khotan far to the east, a coastal settlement that had been one of the oldest and most prosperous. "It is all gone," Rera whispered, his hands trembling around the wooden bowl. "The Wajan, they did not just take our land. They took the sea. They built great ships with engines that roar like demons. They fish with nets that stretch from here to the horizon, scooping everything from the water, the salmon, the herring, the very life of Ripon Kamui. The otters are gone. The seals are gone. The beaches where we gathered food are now crowded with their processing plants, the air thick with the stench of dead fish and smoke." He described a systematic dismantling of life itself. The Ainu of his Khotan were forced into wage labor, paid a pittance to work on the very ships that were destroying their world. Their children were taken to boarding schools far away, where they were beaten for speaking their mother tongue and taught that their ancestors were primitive savages. "They have a new word for us," Rera said, his voice dripping with a bitter irony. "Kutajan, former Aborigines. As if we have stopped being what we are by their decree. They have made our existence illegal, Isamu. Our names, our language, our prayers, all of it, a crime." He told them of a final, desperate resistance. A group of young men, including his own sons, had tried to sabotage one of the fishing weirs. They were caught. The punishment was not just for them, but for the whole Khotan. The Wajan officials had burned their fishing CIPS, their looms, and their storehouses. They had publicly flogged the elders. His sons were sent to a prison on the mainland, a place from which no Ainu ever returned. "I'm the only one who got away," Rera finished, his story spent. "I have been walking for moons, moving at night, living on what I could forage. I heard whispers of a Khotan in the mountains that the Wajan had not found. I had to see if it was true. I had to know if the Ainu still lived anywhere as the Ainu." His testimony was a gut punch to the community of Shin Khotan. They had known their situation was precarious, but they had nurtured the hope that their suffering was unique, that elsewhere their people were enduring, perhaps even thriving in their own hidden valleys. Rera's story shattered that illusion. They were not a bastion. They were a relic. The world outside was not changing. It was being erased and rewritten, and the Ainu were being deliberately edited out of the narrative. That night, a profound despair settled over Shin Khotan. The successful hunt, the abundant foraging, the children learning the old stories. It all felt suddenly fragile, a beautiful sandcastle awaiting the inevitable tide. Kenji, who had always been a man of practical action, felt a cold fury building within him. "We cannot just hide here until they find us," he argued to his father and the other elders as they sat in council. Rera's Khotan fought back. "We must do something. We must find others, organize." "And do what?" Isamu interrupted, his voice weary with the weight of Rera's tale. "Throw rocks at their iron ships? Attack their soldiers with our hunting spears? They would wipe us from the earth without a second thought. What Rera's people did was brave, but it was suicide. It achieved nothing but more suffering. Then what is the answer, father?" Kenji's voice was sharp with frustration. "To hide until the last of us dies of old age, and the Kamui forget our names? The answer," Aina's voice cut through the tension, quiet but absolute, "is to be the memory. Rera did not come here for soldiers. He came here to see if the heart of the Ainu was still beating." She looked at each of them, her tattooed face a mask of ancient resolve. Our fight is not with their guns. It is with time. It is with forgetting. Kenji, your fury is a fire that will burn out. Isamu, your caution is a wall that will eventually crumble. But the stories are a seed. They can lie dormant in the cold, dark earth for a long, long time and still grow when the season is right. Rera, the messenger from a dying world, did not stay long. After a week of rest, he announced his intention to move on, to seek other rumored sanctuaries, to be a carrier of both the bad news and the good. The news that in one hidden valley, the Ainu heart still beat. Before he left, he presented Isamu with a small, carefully wrapped bundle. Inside was a single, beautifully carved enau, its wood dark with age, the shavings perfectly curled. "This is from our Nishipa," Rera said. "The last one." He said it held the prayer for the salmon's return. He told me to give it to a Khotan that still remembered how to pray. Keep it. Use it. Prove him right. As Rera disappeared back into the forest from whence he came, the people of Shinkotan were left with a chilling clarity. Their struggle was not local. It was existential. They were no longer just a village trying to survive. They were an archive, a sanctuary for a culture under siege. The weight of it was terrifying, but also gave their hardship a profound, new meaning. They were not hiding. They were preserving. And as long as they could keep one child chanting, one woman weaving a hidden prayer into cloth, and one old man remembering the euchre, then the Wajan, with all their ships and soldiers, would not have one. The encounter with Rera left an indelible frost on the soul of Shinkotan. The stories the children learned now carried a new, somber weight. They were not just tales of a glorious past, but a sacred trust, a defiance against a world that sought to make them obsolete. Isamu, in particular, seemed to age visibly in the weeks that followed. The fire of leadership that had carried them north and through the first brutal winter was banked, replaced by a deep, contemplative stillness. He spent long hours sitting on the promontory overlooking the valley, his eyes, still sharp, tracing the flight of hawks and the slow march of clouds across the face of the mountain. He was listening, but not to the voices of his people. He was listening to the mountain itself, to Kimun Kamui. He knew his body was failing him. The cold of the last winter had settled deep in his joints, and a persistent cough had taken root in his chest, an unwelcome echo of the plague that had taken Yureshi. But more than his physical decline, he felt a spiritual imperative. Rera's story had been a warning. The old ways were not just fading. They were being actively hunted to extinction. The great Ayamant was a memory for most, a story for the children. But for Isamu, it was a debt unpaid, a conversation left unfinished. He had participated in the small, silent rituals in the forest, but he had never presided over the full, proper sending back of the mountain god in this new land. He felt the absence of it like a hole in the world. One morning, as the first autumn colors began to fire the leaves of the maple trees, he announced his intention to Kenji and the other hunters. "I will hunt Kimun Kamui," he said, his voice allowing no argument. "Not for the pelt to trade, not for the meat alone. I will hunt him so that we may host him, so that we may remember how to say thank you, so that the god of this mountain knows we have not forgotten our manners." A protest died on Kenji's lips as he looked at his father. He saw not the stubbornness of an old man, but the solemn duty of a high priest. This was not a hunt. It was a pilgrimage. The preparation was undertaken with a reverence the Shinkotan had almost forgotten. Isamu fasted and prayed for 3 days, purifying his spirit. He did not use the steel-tipped spears they now relied upon. Instead, he instructed Kenji in the ancient art of flaking obsidian, and together they crafted a traditional spearhead, its glossy black surface catching the light, its creation a prayer in itself. The shaft was of seasoned ash, and Isamu spent hours carving it with the moru patterns, the swirling designs that were the fingerprints of the spirits, the messengers to the divine realm. When he set out, he went alone. This was a negotiation between him and the god. The entire Khotan watched him go, a solitary figure with a gray braid down his back, moving into the gold and crimson tapestry of the autumn forest. The silence he left behind was heavy with prayer. For 5 days, there was no sign. The community went about its work, but their eyes were constantly drawn to the tree line. On the 6th day, a single, echoing shout came from the high valley. Kenji's voice, using the old hunting call that signaled a successful, solemn return. Isamu emerged from the trees, but he was not the same man who had left. He moved slowly, leaning heavily on his spear, which was now stained and used. His face was pale, etched with a pain that was more than physical exhaustion. But in his eyes was a profound, unshakable peace. Behind him, Kenji and 2 other hunters followed, carrying a pole from which hung the immense, shrouded form of the great bear. They did not carry it as a trophy, but as a pallbearers carry a king. The bear was laid with reverence in a specially prepared clearing. As the women prepared a feast and the men built the ritual platform, Isamu, his energy flagging, directed the proceedings. He showed them how to position the head, how to adorn it with the finest enamel they could carve, how to offer it the first and best cuts of its own meat, along with dried fish, millet dumplings, and their precious homemade sake. That night, the ayame began. It was not as grand as the ceremonies of old. There were fewer people, the offerings were humbler, but it was perfect in its intention. Isamu, supported by Kenji, led the chanting. His voice was a ragged whisper, but it carried the full weight of his years and his people's memory. He sang the old songs, the stories of the bear's divine parents, the prayers of gratitude for its gift of life. The people of Shin Khotan joined in, their voices tentative at first, then growing stronger, as if remembering a melody encoded in their blood. They played the tongkori, its melancholic notes weaving through the smoke of the ritual fire. They danced, their movements telling the story of the bear's power and dignity. For 3 days and nights, they were not a hidden, persecuted people. They were the Ainu, hosting a god, fulfilling their part of the ancient contract. The children watched, wide-eyed, as the story Ben had told them around the fire blazed into glorious, terrifying life. On the final morning, as the bear's spirit was sent back to the mountain with a final, collective shout of farewell, Isamu slumped against his son. The effort had consumed the last of his strength. They helped him back to his chais. He lay on his bearskin mat, his breathing shallow. Aina sat beside him, her tattooed hand holding his. "You have done a great thing, my husband," she whispered. "I have settled my account with the mountain," he breathed, a faint smile touching his lips. "The god knows us now. He will remember. Tell the children, tell them the story of this hunt. Not just my hunt, but the hunt of our people. We're the last bear of the old way. It is our time to be sent back with honor, so that our spirit may return one day." Isamu did not see the next sunrise, but his passing was not met with the desperate grief of the plague years. It was a solemn, respectful sorrow. He had not been defeated by the Wagen or by time. He had completed his cycle. He had secured the spiritual recognition of their new home and had given his people one last, perfect memory of what it meant to be Ainu. As they sent his own spirit to the ancestors with the same songs they had sung for the bear, Kenji understood. His father's last hunt was not an ending. It was a seeding. He had planted the full, undiluted truth of their culture so deeply in the heart of Shinkoten that no winter and no Wagen decree could ever freeze it out. The mountain had accepted their offering, and in return had accepted them. The silence left by his Samu's passing was a presence in itself, a heavy, respected quiet that settled over the Shinkoten like a first snow. It was not a void of absence, but a space filled with the echo of his final, monumental act. The memory of the Iron Ant was seared into the community's consciousness. A living flame passed from his hands to theirs. But as the pyre smoke faded and the ritual songs fell silent, the practical reality of leadership fell squarely upon Kenji's shoulders. He was no longer the fiery son arguing for action, nor the apprentice following his father's cautious path. He was the chief. The mantle felt impossibly heavy. His father had been a bridge between two eras, a man who remembered the full glory of the old world and possessed the grim pragmatism to navigate the new one. Kenji felt caught between them. He had his father's love for tradition, but it was a love learned from stories, not from a life lived entirely within its embrace. He had his own inclination for action and adaptation, forged in the crucible of trade and survival in a shrinking world. His first test came with the first snow. It was early and fierce, a blizzard that howled down from the peaks with a vindictive fury that the previous winters had lacked. The hastily built chais, which had sufficed before, proved vulnerable. The wind found cracks they never knew existed, driving fine, powdered snow into the dwellings, extinguishing hearths, and coating sleeping children in a layer of frost. The crude, patched roofs groaned under the weight. Kenji moved through the storm-battered village, his own parka crusted with ice, assessing the damage. An elder's chais had a portion of its roof collapse, nearly crushing the family within. They were huddled, shivering, in a corner, their breath pluming in the unnatural cold of their own home. The look in their eyes was not just one of discomfort, but of a deeper fear, the fear that their sanctuary was fragile, that the mountain could still reject them. The old way, his father's way, would have been to rally the men, to use the materials at hand, to patch and reinforce with prayer and perseverance. But Kenji saw the limitations. Their stone axes and obsidian tools were inadequate for the speed and strength required. They had a few prized steel tools, carefully guarded, but they were for finer work. That night, in a council held in the largest, most secure chais, the debate was heated. "We must make do as we always have," argued one of the older hunters, a contemporary of Isamu. "To use the wage and iron for our homes is to let them into our hearts. The chais is sacred. Its materials must be pure. And if the next storm kills a child?" Kenji's voice was quiet but cut through the smoky air. "Will the purity of the wood be a comfort then? My father's last act was to show us that the spirit of the ritual is what matters, not the tools. He used a traditional spear, yes, but his goal was to feed our souls. My goal now is to shelter our bodies so that our souls have a vessel to continue." He made the decision. He ordered the use of their precious steel hatchets to fell stronger, straighter trees for support beams. He had them use their iron nails to secure the sod roofs more firmly. It was a betrayal of form, a concession to the very world they were hiding from, and he felt the ghost of his father's disapproval. But as the repairs were made, and the chais became stout, windproof fortresses against the storm's rage, he saw the fear in people's eyes recede, replaced by a weary confidence. This was the tightrope he now walked. How much of the outside world could they adopt without losing themselves? The following spring, the question presented itself again. Their hidden valley was rich in game and plants, but lacked one crucial thing, a reliable source of grain. Their millet stocks from the old life were long gone. The children needed the sustenance. Kenji organized a small, clandestine trading mission. He would not go himself. His place was with the Khotan. He sent his most discreet cousin, Rina, and two others, with a carefully selected bundle of goods. A single, magnificent sea otter pelt from Isamu's last hunt, a roll of the finest Atush cloth embroidered with hidden prayers, and a beautifully carved piece of walrus ivory from the north. Their instructions were strict. Go to the fringes of the Wajan settlement, find a trader known to be less connected to the officials, and trade only for seeds, millet, barley, anything that could be grown in their high valley. No airo, no cotton, no sake, just seeds. The wait was agonizing. When Rina returned, his face was grim. The trade had been successful, but the news was not. The world outside was closing in. The Wajan settlement had tripled in size. There were now roads where there had been trails and patrols of armed men. The trader had been nervous, speaking of increased scrutiny, of a government policy called assimilation, which aimed to make the Ainu true Japanese. He had taken their goods and given them a sack of millet seed, but he had warned them not to come back. Kenji took the sack of seeds. They were small, hard, and lifeless in his hand, but they represented a future. He had secured food, but he had also confirmed their isolation. He stood at the edge of the village, the sack in one hand, the weight of his leadership a constant pressure on his neck. He was not the chief his father was. He could not offer his people the pure, untarnished past. All he could offer them was a hybrid future, a life preserved in a hidden valley, using the tools of their enemies to build walls against them, planting stolen seeds to sustain the ancient songs. It was a messy, compromised existence. But as he looked at the children practicing their carving and heard an old woman singing a fragment of a euchre to a toddler, he knew it was an existence. It was life. And for now, in a world that wanted them to disappear, that was a victory. The burden was his to bear, and he would bear it, not with his father's pure flame, but with the stubborn, enduring heat of a banked fire, waiting for its time to burn bright again. The millet seeds, small and tan, and full of the potential that felt both promising and profane, were planted in a sun-drenched clearing near the river. Kenji himself turned the first sod with the steel-bladed shovel, the metal biting into the earth with an efficiency that felt like a minor betrayal of the wooden digging sticks of his ancestors. Yet, as he worked the foreign tool, he recited the old planting prayers his mother, Ainu, had taught him, his voice a low murmur against the scrape of metal on stone. This was the new duality of his leadership, to use the methods of the Wajan to achieve the ends of the Ainu. The field, a geometric scar on the valley's wild face, was a necessary blasphemy. As the millet sprouted, a tender green carpet alien to this place, another blending of worlds was occurring, this one within the very walls of the chais. Tomo, Ainu's granddaughter, was now a young woman. The smooth skin around her lips and on her hands, which should have been gradually darkening with the sacred tattoos of her people, remained unmarked, a visible testament to the edicts that reached even their hidden refuge. The absence was a constant, quiet sorrow for Ainu, a broken thread in the lineage she was meant to pass on. But Tomo possessed her grandmother's fierce spirit and clever hands. She had mastered the traditional art of weaving a tush from the inner bark of the elm, creating the tough, earthy-colored cloth that was their heritage. Yet, she also saw the beauty and utility in the bold, vibrant colors of the traded cotton thread Kenji had secured. One afternoon, she sat with Ainu, a half-finished traditional tunic in her lap, and a small, precious bundle of red and indigo cotton thread beside her. "Grandmother," she began, her voice hesitant. "The patterns, the moru, and the aius, they are our soul. But the waging cloth is strong, and its colors do not fade." She held up the tunic. What if the soul does not care what clothes it wears? What if we weave our prayers onto their cloth? Ainu was silent for a long time, her eyes closed, as if listening to the spirits of her ancestors. She thought of the forbidden tattoos, the marks that would never grace Tomo's skin. She opened her eyes and looked at her granddaughter's smooth, hopeful face. "The Kamui understand the heart, not the thread," Ainu said finally, her voice raspy with age. "The prayer is the same, whether it is whispered on the wind or shouted from mountain. If the old bark is becoming scarce and the new thread is plentiful, then we must speak to the gods in the language we have. Show me." Under Ainu's critical but approving eye, Tomo began a new kind of creation. She used the sturdy, off-white waging cotton as her base. But onto it, with the vibrant red and blue thread, she began to embroider the ancient Ainu patterns. The swirling moru that represented the thorns of the Au's tree, a protective symbol, now stood out in brilliant crimson against the plain background. The sharp, angular AIS patterns, meant to trap evil spirits, were stitched in a deep, powerful indigo. She even dared to combine them, creating a new, hybrid aesthetic, the timeless Ainu symbolism rendered in the bold palette of their oppressors. The first garment she completed was a tunic for a young child. It was undeniably Ainu in its design, but it had a visual punch of vitality that the traditional earth-toned touch lacked. The other women of the Koten gathered around, their initial skepticism giving way to admiration. Soon, a dozen looms and needlework circles were buzzing with this new old art. They were not abandoning their identity. They were armoring it in a new way, making it resilient and adaptable. The hidden prayers were now even more hidden, woven into a medium the Wajan would dismiss as merely native craft, while to the Ainu, they were a vibrant, defiant declaration of survival. This cultural synthesis extended to their spiritual life. The great Ayaman could not be risked again. The smoke and activity might draw unwanted attention. But the need for communal ritual remained. Kenji, advised by the few remaining elders and his own mother, instituted a new ceremony held at the first full moon of the salmon run. They called it the moon gathering. It was not a sending back of a god, but a sending forth of their gratitude. The entire Koten would gather by the river under the luminous eye of Chup Kamui. They would build a large fire and feast on the first caught salmon. Then, instead of a lengthy euchre, different members of the community would stand and share a story. A successful hunt, a memory of the old days, a lesson from a dream. They would sing songs, not just the ancient epics, but new ones they composed about life in the Shin-Koten, about Kenji's leadership, about Tomo's weaving. They were creating a living, evolving culture, one that honored its roots without being chained to a past that was no longer fully accessible. During one such gathering, an old hunter stood. He had been a friend of Isamu's. He held up the steel fishhook he used. "I miss the old ways," he said, his voice clear in the firelight. "I miss the feel of the bone hook, the patience it taught. But this," he said, holding up a large silver salmon caught with that same steel hook, "this feeds my grandson. And a fed grandson can listen to the story of the bone hook. The tool is not the tradition. The full belly that lets the story be heard, that is the tradition." Kenji watched, a lump in his throat. They were finding their way. They were a people in flux, a river that had been forced into a new channel. They were picking up sediment from the foreign banks, steel tools, cotton cloth, new ceremonies, and carrying it along with them, changing the color of their waters, but not their essential flow. They were no longer the pure, isolated Ainu of a century past. They were something new, something resilient. They were learning that survival was not about rejection, but about absorption, not about building a wall, but about learning to flow around the obstacles, carrying the core of who they were into an uncertain future, one woven stitch and one whispered prayer at a time. The rhythm of life in the Shin Koten, though forged in hardship, had settled into a fragile, sustainable cadence. The hybrid millet grew in the cleared field, its golden stalks a testament to Kenji's pragmatic compromise. Tomo's vibrant cotton and thread artistry had become the new standard, the traditional patterns blazing with a defiant color that felt appropriate for their hidden struggle. The children, a new generation born entirely within the sanctuary of the valley, knew the old stories not as memories of a lost world, but as the living mythology of their own. They were Ainu, but their Ainu identity was now intrinsically linked to the specific geography of their refuge, to the particular spirit of this mountain that had tested and ultimately accepted them. It was for these children that Kenji undertook his most ambitious project yet. He feared that the epic scale of their history, the vast geographical and spiritual connectedness of the Ainu people, was being lost. The children knew the stories of Kimun-Kamui, the mountain god, because he was their immediate neighbor. But what of Ripon-Kamui, the god of the sea? For them, the sea was a mythical place from the old stories, a distant rumor of a roaring, salty vastness they had never seen. The great euchre of the whale hunt, the epic voyages to the smoking islands, the trade with the Nifk. These were becoming abstract, like tales of the stars, beautiful but untouchable. He decided to compose a new euchre. It was a radical idea. The old epics were sacred, unchanging, passed down verbatim through the generations. To create a new one was to add a new branch to the sacred tree of their oral tradition. He consulted with Aina, now so old and frail she rarely left her chais, but whose mind remained a clear, deep well of their culture. The euchre is the voice of the Kamui speaking through us. She whispered, her breath a faint rustle. It is not a chain that binds us to the past. It is a river that carries us. If the river course has changed, then its song must change too. Sing the song of our journey, Kenji. Sing the song of this mountain and that forgotten sea. Make a map of our spirit for the children. For weeks, Kenji withdrew. He spent days alone on the high promontory, the place his father had loved, watching the weather gather and break over the peaks. He walked the forest trails, listening. He was not just remembering. He was listening for the new song, the one that wanted to be born from a union of their ancient ways and their desperate, modern survival. The night of the first performance was held during the autumn equinox, a time of balance. The entire Koten gathered around the largest communal fire, the air crisp with the promise of winter. There was a palpable sense of anticipation. Kenji stood before them, not as the pragmatic chief, but as a vessel. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and when he began, his voice was not his own. It was the low, rhythmic, guttural chant of the euchre singer, a sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself. He began not with gods, but with a man based on his father, Isamu. He sang of the grief-stricken Koten, of the shadow of the Wajan, of the courageous decision to flee. He used the traditional repetitive phrases, the onomatopoeia, Shirokanipe ran Pishkin for the shimmer of a tear on a cheek, Patoka for the soft, determined sound of feet on a forest path. He sang of the arduous journey north, making the terrifying vastness of the open land a character in the epic, a testing god. He sang of the first sight of the hidden valley, describing it not just as a place, but as a sleeping Kamui waiting to be awakened. Then he wove in the old world. He sang of the sea, Ripon Kamui, not as a distant memory, but as a grieving parent left behind. He sang of the great whales and the sea otters, their spirits calling out to the exiled Ainu. He sang of the Nifk, Daxakurkamui, the spirit of Daxa, and their meeting on the stony beach, the trade of not just goods, but of respect. He was connecting their present sanctuary to the entire tapestry of their past, showing that this valley was not an isolation cell, but a single, fiercely guarded room in the great, sprawling house of the Ainu world. The climax of the new Euchre was the hunt of Kimun Kamui. He sang of his father's last, great ritual, imbuing it with a mythic quality, transforming his Samu from a mere man into a heroic intermediary who had secured their spiritual lease on this land. He sang of the sending back ceremony, the smoke carrying their prayers, and the mountain's acceptance, which he symbolized by a sudden, warm wind that had, in truth, stirred the fire's smoke on the third night. He ended the epic not with an ending, but with a question, a thread left for the future. He sang of the children, the new saplings in the mountain's shadow, and their duty to remember the song of the sea, even as they lived in the heart of the mountain. He finished, his voice fading on a long, sustained note that hung in the cold air before being swallowed by the crackle of the fire. The silence that followed was profound, thick with emotion. Then, old Aina, from her place by the hearth, began to clap, a slow, deliberate, powerful sound. The rest of the community joined, not with cheers, but with this respectful, thunderous applause. They had not just been told a story. They had witnessed the birth of a new scripture. Kenji had done more than preserve the past. He had proven that their culture was alive, that it could still grow and create and sing its own existence into being. A young boy, Kenji's own grandson, approached him, his eyes wide. "Grandfather," he whispered, "is the sea truly that big, and will I ever see it?" Kenji placed a hand on the boy's head. "The song is the map, little one," he said, his voice hoarse from the chant. "As long as you can sing it, you carry the sea within you. And one day, when the world turns again, you will find your way back to its shore." The new Euchre was not just a story. It was a promise, a compass, and a seed of hope planted deep in the heart of the next generation. Time, the one force that respected neither Weijin edicts nor Ainu prayers, continued its inexorable march. In the Shin-Koten, its passage was marked not by the turning of official calendars, but by the slow, gentle fading of the oldest generation. Aina, the matriarch, the keeper of the old ways, and the instigator of the new, passed in her sleep during the deep of winter. She was found by Tomo, peaceful and cold, her tattooed hands folded over her chest, the intricate blue lines on her skin the last of their kind in the valley. Her death was a quiet cataclysm. She was the final, living bridge to the world before the sickness, before the traders, before the exodus. With her, a specific frequency of knowledge, the precise inflection of a forgotten prayer, the secret property of a rare herb, the true meaning of a half-remembered Euchre fragment, was silenced forever. Her funeral was a fusion of the old and the new. They could not risk the smoke of a traditional Ainu cremation, so they buried her in a secret grove of ancient pines, a place she had loved. But they sent her spirit to the ancestors with the full, sung Euchre for the dead, the same one they had used for Isamu. Kenji and Tomo led the chanting, their voices weaving together, the chief and the artisan honoring the wise woman. They placed her most precious possessions in the grave with her. Her finest weaving knife, a small, perfect Ainu, and the first piece of cotton cloth Tomo had ever embroidered with the traditional patterns. It was a testament to the transition she had overseen. Her passing left a tangible void. The Khotan felt younger, louder, less anchored. The remaining elders were few, and their memories were becoming like patchy snow in the spring sun, full of gaps. It was during this period of generational shift that the world outside, which they had worked so hard to keep at bay, made its presence felt in a new and terrifying way. It began with the animals. The deer grew skittish, not just from the presence of hunters, but from a new, alien scent that drifted on the wind from the south. It was the smell of coal smoke and industry, a metallic, acrid tang that was a profound offense to the clean, organic smells of the forest. Then, the hunters started to find them. Trees blazed with strange, painted symbols. They were not the subtle, spiritual signs of the Kamui. They were harsh, geometric marks in garish orange paint, slashed onto the trunks to designate property lines for logging concessions. The wage and surveyors were getting closer. Worst of all was the sound. On certain days, when a wind blew from the south, a faint, low, rhythmic thumping would reach them. It was not the familiar crash of a tree falling in a storm. It was mechanical, relentless, the sound of an axe that never grew tired, wielded by a giant of metal and steam. It was the sound of the clear cutting, the systematic devouring of the forest, and it was moving steadily toward their hidden valley. Fear, a cold and familiar serpent, coiled in the belly of the Shin Khotan. The debates began again, more frantic this time. Some of the younger men, who had only known the safety of the valley, argued for a preemptive strike, for ambushing a logging crew, for making their presence known through violence. And then what? Kenji's voice cut through the panic in the council chais. He looked older, the weight of years and leadership having carved his father's sternness into his own face. They would send not surveyors, but soldiers. They have maps, Kenji. They have numbers we cannot imagine. A wasp can sting a man, but the man will simply burn the nest. So we do nothing. One of the young men shot back, his fists clenched. We wait for them to cut down our forest, and then politely ask us to move again. We do not do nothing, Kenji said, his voice dropping to a strategic whisper. We make this valley a fortress they do not want to assault. We make it more trouble than it is worth. He unveiled a plan born of desperation and cunning. It was not a plan of war, but of misdirection and spiritual guerrilla tactics. He sent out their best trackers, not to hunt, but to haunt. Their task was to follow the surveyors and loggers, to remain unseen, and to sabotage their work in small, untraceable ways. They would loosen the blades on their equipment, scatter the marked piles of lumber in the night, and pollute their fuel with water and dirt. More importantly, they would use the Wajin's own superstitions against them. The Ainu knew this land was alive with Kamui. Now they would make the Wajin feel it. The trackers would place carefully carved Ainu in the path of the logging crews, at the foot of trees marked for cutting. They would use animal calls and hidden noisemakers to create unsettling sounds in the deep woods. They would orchestrate bad luck. A perfectly healthy tree would fall in an unexpected direction. A tool would break at a crucial moment. A crew member would suffer a sudden, unexplained illness after disturbing a particular rock formation. It was a war of perception. They were painting their valley as a cursed, haunted place, a domain of angry spirits that did not welcome the intrusion of industry. Kenji, the man who had built a new yukur, was now composing a new kind of story for a foreign audience, a horror story. The Shin Khotan was no longer just a refuge. It was a stage for a grand, desperate deception. They were forging a new weapon from the oldest metal they possessed, their intimate, sacred knowledge of the land. They would fight the steam and steel of the Wajan with the whispers of the Kamui. It was a fragile defense, a spider web against an axe, but it was all they had. The fading of the old guard had forced the new one to forge a new kind of resistance. One fought not with spears, but with shadows and stories. The campaign to defend the Shinkoten became a silent, shadow war, a conflict fought not on open ground, but in the realm of perception and nerves. Kenji's trackers, led by his own son, Hanto, became ghosts in the forest they were protecting. They moved with a silence learned from childhood, their footfalls absorbed by the thick carpet of moss and pine needles, their bodies blending into the dappled light and shadow of the canopy. They were the unseen hands of the mountain, the instruments of its subtle, growing wrath. Hanto, now a man in his prime with his grandfather's keen eyes and his father's strategic mind, took to the task with a grim fervor. His first act of sabotage was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. He had observed a Wajan logging crew, noting their superstitious habit of leaving offerings of rice and sake at a small, makeshift shrine before beginning work each day, a futile attempt to appease spirits they did not understand. One night, Hanto and his team carefully gathered the offerings. Then, with painstaking care, they carved a dozen inao, the sacred prayer sticks with their curled, messenger shavings. They did not place them gently. They drove them into the earth around the shrine in a menacing circle, and in the center, they left the Wajan offerings, now scattered and defiled, mixed with the bones of a fox they had found. The message was not one of welcome, but of contempt. The next morning, the loggers found the site. The foreman, a pragmatic man from Osaka, scoffed, but his crew, local Hokkaido men who had grown up with whispers of the Ainu and their powerful spirits, were visibly shaken. Work was slow that day, the men jumpy and glancing over their shoulders. The forest, which had once been a simple source of timber, now felt watchful, hostile. The sabotage escalated in cleverness and audacity. The trackers learned the rhythms of the steam-powered saws. In the dead of night, they would sneak into the camps and pour fine, abrasive sand into the engine oil reservoirs. The result was not an immediate breakdown, but a slow, grinding death of the machinery, a series of inexplicable mechanical failures that cost the company time and money. They would loosen the vital bolts on the ox-drawn carts used to haul lumber, causing wheels to fall off at inopportune moments. They became experts in the art of the untraceable accident, but their most powerful weapon was fear. Using his knowledge of the land, Hanto could mimic animal calls with uncanny accuracy. He would position his men around a logging site, and, at a signal, they would unleash a chorus of sounds that did not belong together. The scream of a hawk mixed with the deep-throated growl of a bear, the chattering of a fox with the hoot of an owl. The resulting cacophony was unnerving, a violation of the forest's natural order that set the loggers' teeth on edge. They began reporting seeing fleeting, shadowy figures between the trees, of feeling an overwhelming sense of being watched. The story of the cursed valley began to circulate among the Wajan workers. Men requested transfers. Productivity plummeted. One afternoon, the conflict reached a new intensity. A surveyor, a bold and arrogant young man from Tokyo who mocked the local superstitions, deliberately chopped down an ancient, gnarled willow tree that stood at the head of a sacred stream the Ainu knew as a place of healing. To him, it was an obstacle. To the Ainu, it was the dwelling place of a powerful water spirit. That night, Hanto's team acted. They did not sabotage equipment. Instead, They located the surveyor's tent. While he slept, they surrounded it with a ring of sharpened stakes, each one tipped with the white clay of the riverbank, a sign of death and pollution in Ainu symbolism. On his chest, they placed the severed head of a salmon, its eyes milky and accusing. When the man awoke at dawn and stumbled out of his tent, he found himself in this grotesque tableau. He screamed, a raw, primal sound of terror that echoed through the camp. He was on the next wagon back to the coastal town, babbling about demon foxes and vengeful tree spirits, and he never returned. The news of this event was the tipping point. The cost of operating in this particular valley, the broken equipment, the delayed schedules, the plummeting morale, and now the outright terror began to outweigh the value of its timber. The logging company, a pragmatic entity concerned with profit, not conquest, made a calculation. The survey maps were updated. The valley was marked with a new, single-word notation, one that would be passed down for decades in the company's records. Masho. The haunted place. Weeks later, the sounds of the forest began to change. The distant mechanical thumping ceased. The alien scent of coal, smoke gradually dissipated, carried away on the clean mountain wind. The painted marks on the trees were not followed by the bite of saws. The wagon had retreated. When Hanto and his trackers confirmed that the last of the equipment and men had been pulled out, they returned to the Shinkoten. They did not return as conquering heroes, but as weary, solemn guardians. They reported to Kenji not with boasts, but with quiet facts. Kenji listened, then walked to the edge of the village, looking south towards the lands they had defended. He felt no triumph, only a bone-deep relief and a chilling understanding. They had won a battle, not by being stronger, but by being more clever, more patient, and more intimately connected to the battlefield. They had turned the Wajan's own ignorance and fear against them. But it was a temporary victory. The world was still out there, growing, consuming. They had protected their sanctuary for now, but they had also reinforced its walls, deepening their isolation. The war of whispers was over. The long, silent vigil continued. They had proven that the spirit of the Ainu could still fight, but the cost of that fight was a further retreat from the world, a deeper entrenchment in the role of ghosts in their own land. The successful defense of the valley, the retreat of the Wajan loggers, instilled in the Shinkoten a new, hard-won confidence. They were no longer just survivors, they were defenders. They had faced the modern world's advance and, through cunning and a deep understanding of their home, had turned it back. This victory, however, did not change their fundamental reality. They remained a people in hiding, their culture a flickering flame carefully shielded from the winds of assimilation. The passing of Aina had left a void in the transmission of the most intimate, woman-centric knowledge, and it fell upon Tomo, now the undisputed master of the Khotan's textile arts, to ensure the flame did not die. Tomo was no longer the young woman experimenting with cotton thread. She was a mother, a teacher. Her own hands, though forever untattooed, were as skilled as her grandmother's had ever been. She understood that the knowledge of plants, of dyes, of the symbolic language of patterns, was as vital to their survival as the knowledge of hunting or building a chais. It was the soft, enduring armor of their identity. One morning, as the first light of dawn painted the mountain peaks in rose and gold, she gathered the girls and young women of the village not in a chais, but out in the meadow where the dye plants grew. Your great-grandmother, Aina, taught me that the forest is a palette, Tomo began, her voice clear and calm. She knelt by a cluster of plants with small, greenish-yellow flowers. This is Yamabuki, Caria, Its roots, when boiled for a day and a night, will give you a color like the sun at harvest. She moved to a gnarled, old alder tree, scraping a piece of its bark with her thumbnail. This, when fermented with iron-rich mud from the riverbank, will give you a black that is deeper than a moonless night, a color of protection and power. She led them on a walk, a living lecture on botany and spirituality intertwined. She showed them the mosses that yielded soft greens, the leaves that produced a rusty orange, the rare lichen that, with precise preparation, could create a brilliant purple. For each plant, she did not just give its name and use. She told its story, its connection to the kamui, the season it was to be harvested, and the prayer that must be said to thank it for its gift. This was knowledge that had no place in a Wajan schoolbook. It was a song of the land, passed from hand to hand, from memory to memory. Back in the open space used for weaving, the lesson continued at the loom. Tomo had set up a complex backstrap loom, a newer, larger one she had designed herself. The Wajans see a simple pattern, she said, her fingers beginning the rhythmic dance of the shuttle. They see decoration, but we see a map. We see a prayer. She pointed to the emerging design. This diamond pattern, the sea ink, is the scale of the fish, a prayer for abundance from pet kamui. This zigzag, the ratar kamui, is the lightning, a symbol of the sky god's power. And this, she said, her voice dropping as she traced a complex, interlocking spiral that formed the garment's central motif. This is the story of our journey to this valley. It is the path of the river we followed, the shape of the mountain that shelters us, and the cycle of the seasons that sustain us. To weave this is to tell our history. To wear it is to carry our home with you. She then did something radical. She brought out a piece of paper and a stick of charcoal, rare treasures acquired from the last, furtive trading mission. The Wajan write their stories down, she said. We have always carried ours in our heads and in our cloth. But there are so few of us now. We must be like the squirrel and hide our nuts in many places. She carefully laid a piece of finished embroidery onto the paper and began to rub the charcoal over it, transferring the pattern onto the page. It was a crude but effective copy. We will make a book, she announced to the astonished women. Not of words, but of patterns. We will draw every moru, every us, every clan symbol we remember. We will write down the recipes for the dyes. We will not let this knowledge die with us. It was an act of profound adaptation. They were using the technology of the culture that sought to erase them to preserve the very things it sought to destroy. The project became a communal obsession. The women spent their evenings by the fire, not just weaving, but drawing, their heads bent together over precious scraps of paper, arguing over the exact curve of spiral, the precise name of a plant. Tomo's young daughter, Ainu, named for her great-grandmother, proved to have a gifted hand for the drawings, her lines clean and sure. The pattern book, as it came to be known, was more than an archive. It was an act of faith in the future. It was a message in a bottle thrown into the river of time, a belief that one day someone would find it and understand the language woven into its pages. One evening, as Tomo watched her daughter meticulously draw the pattern for the owl's eye, a symbol of wisdom, she felt a profound sense of continuity. The physical tattoos were gone, banned into history. But the patterns themselves, the knowledge, the meaning was being transcribed, passed on. The legacy was no longer inscribed on skin, but it was being woven into the very fabric of their consciousness, and now, onto paper. They were ensuring that even if the looms fell silent, the designs would not be forgotten. The war for their culture was not just fought with whispers in the forest, but with a quiet, persistent scratch of charcoal on paper a silent, stubborn declaration that their story was not over. The loom of memory was still weaving, its shuttle moving steadily, patiently, creating a tapestry meant to outlast them all. The decades folded into one another within the hidden valley, each year a self-contained cycle of survival, memory, and quiet resistance. Kenji's hair turned the color of the winter snow that crowned their protective mountains, and the leadership of the Shin-Koten began its slow, natural transition to his son, Hanto. The boy who had once marveled at his grandfather's story of the white whale was now a man, a father himself, with the same steady gaze and a mind that had been shaped entirely by the secret, demanding life of the refuge. The pattern book begun by Tomo had grown into a thick, sacred bundle of papers, a visual encyclopedia of their culture, guarded as closely as their ancestral swords. The outside world, which they had fought so hard to keep at bay, was not static. The faint, industrial thrum from the south had become a constant, low-grade hum, a permanent feature of the soundscape on certain winds. The Wajan settlement was now a town, then a small city, its influence spreading like a slow-moving stain. And then a new sound joined the chorus, one that was at once terrifying and mesmerizing. It was a high, lonesome whistle, followed by a deep, rhythmic chuffing and the screech of metal on metal. The railroad had come to Hokkaido. Its arrival was a seismic event, even in their isolation. The first time the train's whistle echoed through their valley, it was mistaken for some monstrous new Kamui. Children cried, and hunters gripped their spears, their faces pale. It was a sound of impossible power and speed, a sound that mocked distance and conquered geography. For the elders like Kenji, it was the final, undeniable proof that the world they had known was gone, replaced by something they could no longer comprehend, let alone resist. It was this new reality that brought the messenger. He did not come with the armed arrogance of a Matsumi official, nor the desperate weariness of Rera. He arrived on foot, but he was well-equipped, with a sturdy pack and boots of modern leather. He was a young Ainu man, perhaps in his early 20s, but he was dressed in rough Wajan trousers and a work shirt. His name was Shigeru, and he carried himself with a nervous energy that was foreign to the measured pace of the Shin-Koten. He was found by Hanto's hunters at the very edge of their territory, not as an intruder, but as a lost soul, calling out in a mixture of Japanese and broken Ainu, asking if anyone was there. He was brought before Kenji and Hanto, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe as he took in the traditional chais, the people in their hybrid clothing, the palpable sense of a living, breathing Ainu world. I heard stories, Shigeru stammered, accepting a bowl of water with trembling hands. From my grandfather. He said his brother fled into the mountains a lifetime ago. He said there might be a Koten that remembered. He looked around, his gaze lingering on the face of an old woman, one of the last with faded lip tattoos. I didn't believe it was true. He told him his story. He had been born in a government-designated Ainu settlement near the coast, a place of poverty and cultural desolation. He had been given a Japanese name and education. He spoke Ainu haltingly, as a second language learned in secret from his grandfather. He had left, seeking work on the new railroad cruise, a grueling job that paid little but offered a glimpse of the island. He was a man caught between worlds, not fully Wajan and no longer fully Ainu, a living product of the assimilation policies. The world is changing faster now, Shigeru said, his voice gaining a desperate intensity. The railroad, it connects everything. There are new laws, too, not as harsh as before. Some Japanese scholars, they are even interested in Ainu culture. They want to record our songs, study our tools before they disappear. He said the last word with a painful flinch, as if realizing the irony of saying it to them. He brought news that was both shocking and disorienting. The Meiji Restoration had transformed Japan. The Matsumi domain was gone, absorbed into a new, centralized government. The official persecution had eased, replaced by a policy of forced assimilation that was, in its own way, just as effective. But there was, he said, a faint glimmer of something else. A tiny, emerging movement among a few Japanese and a handful of educated Ainu to recognize the value of their culture, not as a curiosity, but as a heritage. Kenji listened, his aged face a mask of stoic calm, but his mind was reeling. The enemy he had spent his life hiding from had changed its face, its name, and its tactics. It was no longer a sword to be avoided, but a slow, sweet poison to be absorbed. The offer of study felt like a new kind of theft. Hanto, however, saw a flicker of something else. "You say there are others?" he asked, his voice low. "Other Ainu? How many? Where?" Shigeru shrugged, a gesture of profound hopelessness. "Scattered. In the settlements. In the cities. Many have forgotten. Many are ashamed. They hide who they are to find work, to marry. We are fading." He looked at Hanto, his eyes pleading. "But you are not fading. You are here. You are real." The arrival of Shigeru was a crack in the walls of their sanctuary. He was a window to a world they had turned their backs on, a world where their people were not hiding in mountains, but were dissolving into the majority, their identity becoming a whispered secret, a source of shame. The Shinkoten was not just a refuge. It was, Shigeru made them understand, a last, vibrant stronghold. But it was a stronghold under a new kind of siege, not of soldiers and surveyors, but of time, modernity, and the slow, seductive promise of belonging to the conquering culture. The world beyond the peaks was no longer just a threat. It was a complex, confusing reality where the very definition of what it meant to be Ainu was being contested, and they, in their hidden valley, held one of the last pure answers. The presence of Shigeru, the messenger from a changed world, lingered in the Shinkoten like a strange perfume, both alluring and unsettling. He stayed for a full cycle of the moon, a living ghost from a future they had resisted. He ate their food, listened with rapt attention to the fragments of Euchre the Elders could still recall, and ran his fingers over the pages of Tomo's pattern book with a reverence that bordered on grief. He was seeing a reflection of a soul his own generation had almost lost. His departure was as quiet as his arrival. He promised silence, understanding the sacred trust of their secret. But as he disappeared back into the forest, he carried something invaluable with him. The certain knowledge that the heart of the Ainu still beat, strong and defiant, in the high mountains. He was a seed himself, now, carrying the pollen of their unyielding identity back to the scattered, fading communities of the lowlands. His visit forced a profound and painful counsel among the people of the valley. The question hung in the air, unspoken but deafening. What now? They had achieved their goal. They had preserved a pure strain of their culture against impossible odds. But to what end? To be a living museum, a secret that died with the last of them? Or was there a greater responsibility? Kenji, his body frail but his spirit clear, summoned Hanto and Tomo to his chais. The fire cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, illuminating the ancient in now and the bundled pattern book. The hunter who only guards his kill does not feed his children, Kenji said, his voice a dry whisper. We have guarded our way of life. It is a precious kill, but it is time to share the meat. He looked at his son, Hanto. Your strength, kept the wolves from our door. But a new season is coming. It will require a different kind of strength, the strength to open the door. He turned to Tomo. Your patterns are a beautiful song, but a song sung only to these mountains is a lament. It must be heard by other ears. The Wagen scholar Shigeru spoke of, they want to study us as if we are a bone from a forgotten animal. We must show them we are still alive. We must teach them the song. This was Kenji's final decree as chief. The era of absolute isolation was over. It was a terrifying leap of faith. But the alternative, allowing everything they had saved to turn to dust in their hidden valley, was a betrayal of every sacrifice that had been made to preserve it. The transition was slow, cautious, and masterminded by Hanto. He did not lead a procession down the mountain. Instead, he began a controlled, deliberate outreach. He identified a few trusted individuals from the fringes of the Ainu community that Shigeru had spoken of, elders who still remembered fragments, young people filled with a desperate curiosity. They were brought to the valley in secret, one or two at a time, on moonless nights. These visits were a form of cultural transfusion. The visitors would sit with Kenji and the other elders, listening to the old stories, hearing the proper pronunciation of words they had only ever seen miswritten in Japanese texts. They would watch Tomo and her weavers, learning the true meanings behind the patterns that were being commercialized as mere craft in the towns below. They would hold the sacred now and learn the prayers. They were not students studying a dead language. They were patients receiving a life-saving medicine. Tomo's pattern book became their most powerful tool. She and her daughter began to make careful copies of key pages. These were not given freely, but entrusted to those who had proven their sincere desire to learn and rebuild. These copies became the seeds of a cultural revival in the lowlands, allowing Ainu there to reconnect with artistic and spiritual traditions that had been systematically erased. When Kenji passed, it was not an ending, but a fulfillment. His spirit was sent to the ancestors with the most complete Ayaman-style ceremony they had dared since his father's time, a powerful, resonant declaration of their enduring identity. Hanto became the chief, not just of the Shinkoten, but the unofficial guardian of a renascent Ainu spirit. Years turned into decades. The world outside changed beyond recognition. The city grew, its lights now visible as a faint orange glow on the southern horizon. But something else grew too, a new pride. The Ainu Cultural Promotion Act, a late and imperfect but significant gesture, was passed by the Japanese government. Scholars did come, but now they often came not as condescending anthropologists, but as humble guests, invited by a people who now had the confidence to dictate the terms of their own representation. And on the floor of a modern apartment in Sapporo, an old woman named Ainu, Tomo's granddaughter, named for the great matriarch, spreads out a worn, carefully preserved copy of the pattern book. Her own granddaughter, a little girl with bright, curious eyes, points to a swirling moru. "What's that, Abakin?" the little girl asks in Japanese. The old woman smiles, her face, like her great-great-grandmother's, untattooed, but her heart inscribed with the same ancient patterns. She switches to the Ainu language, a language now taught in community centers and cherished in homes. "That little one," she says, her voice soft but sure, "is the path of the river god. It is a prayer for a safe journey. It is a story from a hidden valley where your great-great-great-grandparents refused to forget who they were. It is a map that led us back to ourselves." She begins to tell the story. She tells of Okikirmi who listened to the land, of Aina who wore the marks of their people, of Isamu who sailed to the edge of the world, and of Kenji who kept the embers alive through the long winter. She tells of the hidden valley, the war of whispers, and the weaving of two worlds. The little girl listens, captivated, the ancient saga unfolding not as a relic, but as her own inheritance. The circle, bent and strained almost to breaking, was now unbroken. The song of the Ainu, once a whisper in a single, hidden hearth, was now a chorus, sung in many voices, in many places. It was no longer just about survival. It was about legacy. The bones of the mountain had whispered, and their children across the generations had finally learned not just to listen, but to answer.